Foundation: upheaval. The human soul was not created by accident. Just as every building that stands and every tool is designed, a soul was the offspring of creativity and hubris. A mysterious being known only as the One created the world in the small pocket of the universe in which it resides today. No reason was shared and no answer was hidden as to why the One created this place, nor is there enlightenment as to where this divine being came from or how it came to be. All that is true is that the One created the soul in its own visage. The soul didn't come first, however. The idea was brought forth in the infancy of this realm, but the stage had to be set before anything else. With an inexperienced hand, the One spawned life in many simple forms. Plants, the sun, a gust of wind, and animals alike. Flourishing with color and bliss, a vision slowly settled into place. Limitations were removed as intrigue and its own power grew. Soon vast mountain ranges erupted from the earth and deep pockets of water were trenched across the globe, each with new life to occupy the space. Soon the being witnessed how these biomes steadily expanded out of its own control. A winter's chill and summer's blaze cycled over time, affecting all current life that it had made. Over millions of years, the One experimented with different forms of life in different climates to occupy land, sea, and air, obsessed with the new struggle that became readily apparent with every addition and subtraction. Balance. The more that was created, the more the world required its constant maintenance. Otherwise, it would collapse as inevitably the harsh conditions would grow and overpower serenity, causing the One to wipe the slate clean over and over. The world was tested. Sometimes, though, the world fell into chaos. Volcanoes and hurricanes ravaged the planet, making it impossible for existing life to perpetuate without interference. Other times, the oceans remained docile, and nary a harsh wind would topple a tree. This resulted in stagnation, where the world grew quiet and organic progression stopped. The One came to understand that in order for this world to exist without its touch, it needed to introduce a variable that could keep balance all on its own. After much contemplation and many more trials, the world was wiped one more time. Taking many inspirations from existing animals, it designed a deeply complex being, self-sufficient with many stages in its life for growth and adaptation under many various conditions. But then, just before spawning the species on its soil, a final consideration took place. The One had an epiphany, a revelation that led to the creation of a divine substance emulating that of its own construct. Emotions, virtues, rational thinking, morality. So many shards of what this being represented were carefully mimicked and crafted into a small but very powerful energy. A soul. Each new biped that was granted a soul started to exhibit behaviors never before seen. Intelligent interaction which evolved into language, communication which resulted in community, which itself introduced structure. So many traits never before seen started developing over thousands of years as these inhabitants evolved into what the One now called humans. A peculiar thing then happened. The souls resonating within these humans had a mysterious influence on other living creatures. Those that displayed more positivity passed along similar emotions to animals and other humans, while negativity begot negativity just the same. After all this time, their intuitive minds had deduced something magical about themselves, something they all had in common. A whisper in the wind introduced the word, and it spread like wildfire. The idea of a soul became commonplace amongst the species and was often cited as the cause to many of their interactions. Concepts like love, hate, willpower, depression, and many, many more were all attributed to an individual's soul. At first, the One believed that knowledge would bring them closer together. Instead, it diversified them into clusters. Many new beliefs were formed, and the humans found ways to segregate themselves from one another, a new variable. Even though the makeup of every soul started the same, each one drastically changed over the course of human lifespan. Even the offspring were brought into this world with a soul of their very own. The One watched while humanity expanded across the globe with their very presence altering everything they came across. Destroying and building, fighting and loving, such altercations led to inevitable death, and with this came the liberation of tattered souls. Each and every soul that returned to the One had to be reformed and distributed again, a laborious task that led to another idea. With little effort, a new cycle was set in place. When a soul leaves the body, it was destined to distribute its energy into the world itself, providing enough energy to fuel that which was maintained by the One. Plant life, water, air, anything and everything that required the touch of the Maker was sustained by the deceased. As for the conscience of those to pass, they too were set to automatically redistribute among a new generation. A perfect, non-intrusive cycle that allowed the One to closely monitor the balance without having to lift a finger. For a while, everything was working out as intended. Humans surpassed every previous generation in technology, science, and culture, far exceeding expectations. The population exploded as life expectancy increased, but soon, new issues arose. Problems such as food shortage, pollution, and loss of faith. The ultimate downfall of their lives was uncertainty. While many aligned themselves with different religions, worshipping false idols and old gods, a vast number remained either willfully ignorant or chose a darker allegiance. Inversely, many chose the path of light, becoming harbingers of purity and goodwill to the masses, countering those that derived pleasure from violence and war. Nevertheless, within every soul was a troubled existence. Not a single human had an answer as to how they came to be or why they existed in the first place. A lack of purpose crumbled countless minds as the One noticed many changes in its precious children. Still, it did not interfere, because the balance had remained throughout all this time. With that, the One had decided to rest, momentarily drifting away from its incubator and leaving the humans to live without its judging eye. A heavy sleep befell the One as life persisted in the background. Each cycle around the benevolent sun, humanity grew further and further from the desired equilibrium. Imperfections in the reproduction of the species caused future generations to grow intolerant. Time between great conflicts shortened. A belief in a higher power was either used to oppress or snuffed entirely. Those that stood for good and righteousness dwindled, and corruption was spreading like wildfire. In the darkest part of history, even the souls that once represented purity and divinity had soured, mutating into fierce demons that manipulated those teetering on the line to the side of hatred. With that horrid infection came a new understanding of worldly energies. With nothing but time and a desire for chaos, the demons crawled the surface in search of what bled life, feeling that resonant power within themselves and others that mirrored them, hidden in plain sight. They hunted. Soon, those that grew powerful enough in their own right discovered those precious pockets of energy where the souls siphoned through, and then the perversion of life began. Every deceased soul destined to be recycled was stolen and raped, absorbed by the unnatural spawn and used to further mutate. Overflowing with magic they didn't understand, this rising faction unintentionally ripped a hole in the air, opening a doorway to a foreign dimension. Undenounced to the One, every time a draft of the world was smothered and restarted, that process of annihilation caused a ripple to surge through the perceivable universe. That ripple carried with it a ghostly fragment of the previous world in the form of an overlapping dimension that existed just outside of this one, and imperceptible to all. A reality dubbed as Underworld was adopted, and the reign of evil dawned on mankind while their maker slept. Underworld was a realm lost and forgotten in a time just before the souls came to be, an earth entirely devoid of the sun, instead kept alight by a molten landscape and core that spewed massive amounts of radiation. Any life that could be sustained was horribly violent and inane. This adopted dimension fueled the horrid energies that circulated within and further manipulated their already contorted minds. Hungry, ravenous, this malice shifted the spirits of many predisposed to negativity. A wave of decadence consumed weak and broken spirits, and the world plunged deeper into madness. Those who forfeited their morality and adapted to a life of misery and hate were engulfed by that same writhing invasive vigor. With every new dead soul came new energy to feast on and share amongst the vindictive. Fight as they may, the powers of good were no match for the overwhelming darkness. Evil had persuasion, a tendency to imprint harmful ideas and negligence with tainted fingers, deploying spiritual poison throughout the souls of those lingering, walking the tightrope of sanity. This overgrowth of negative energy and the stealing of Earth's precious pockets of souls caused the planet itself to decay. Natural resources dried out and all life was pushed to its limits. A shred of humanity was all that remained, unsalvageable but so very familiar to those who opposed the dreadful incarnations. This restraint did not last, and soon hostility was the only means for survival. The demons found power in the trembling, fickle hearts of man, exploiting their fear and malcontent to get a foothold on the forces of light. Now only violence would counter violence. With the majority of the population tainted and mangled, the last beacon of hope slowly started to fade. With that will submitted, the forces of evil coagulated into a single form, a volatile disease of swarming mist that vastly expanded, lashing out raging tendrils of smoke and crackling static that decimated and absorbed all that opposed it. Putrescent manipulation devoured every living thing it came across as it made a journey across the globe. At last, the One awoke to a thunderous roar of agony. The collective screams of its precious children finally reached the great being, and it rose in horror. From where it sat, the exact reasons behind this catastrophe could not be analyzed. All it knew was that this reality was crumbling. Furious and impatient, the One cast a heavy wave of cleansing magic to sterilize the planet so it may determine what had caused such a collapse. However, the spell had no effect. Instead, a deafening howl accompanied by a vision of tainted mist was broadcast to the Creator's mind. The spawn of evil had grown so powerful that the One could not wipe it clean. Watching as the world was consumed, the One weighed the few options it had. Ultimately, only one resolution could near guarantee the souls would be saved. It descended with heavenly light to meet the giant cloud, taking on the shape of humanity, though devoid of features. The One boasted a beautiful slate of piercing white essence as its body, and set foot on the crumbling soil before the beast. The amalgamation retained a size comparable to a mountain, its presence accompanied by the thunder and raging winds. The moment the two occupied the planet, many more tears in reality split open like lesions to another time, a different world. Witnessing such a reaction, the One lowered its head in shame. It understood this creature was a mistake, a consequence of its own hubris that it must now take responsibility for, otherwise the perfection of the soul would be unattainable. A flare of holy light glistened across the land as the One began its repentance. The darkness that loomed, for a brief moment, exhibited fear. A massive shockwave spread across the earth, which struck every ounce of remaining life to the ground. For the first time in over 100 years, the world was silent. Acting on instinct, the darkness closed in to devour the transient being, only to be met by a simple gesture. The One rose its translucent hand in the air, of request. Halted by this motion, it idled in a confused state. An immense static built up between them, and the climate responded accordingly. Their power pulled together, a new storm was constructed above. Dark clouds quickly formed and ripped at the Earth's surface with an unforgiving blitz of lightning strikes. These cracks of natural fury severed the skin of the Earth, causing the ground to split apart and fill with the heavy rainstorm. Tornadoes skipped over the crevice, picking up wildfires and throwing the flames for miles around. At the center of the apocalyptic scenario caused by this manifested energy, the two maintained a short distance. A small gap, easily closed, protected by a dome formed from their clashing power. The darkness twitched and fluctuated rapidly. Its pulsing, smoky mass held its ground without sign of weakness, while the hope of humanity stood lax yet proud. Its collective conscience evaluated its opposition, keeping that single hand raised. Then, with a flick of its wrist, the storm ceased, and all the surrounding air was thrown outward, reformed as a smooth, gentle wind that rushed over the surface of the planet. The dead and corrupted forest turned to dust, and the lifeless oceans evaporated into thin air. All else living was broken down and fueled this purging wave. The dense fog of malicious imbalance was further shaken by this display of reconciliation. Provoked and wrought with desire, it too took shape. A show of respect and intrigue, condensing its all-encompassing form of tightly packed darkness into a figure mirroring its opposition. They stood together, face to face. Polarized opposites of clashing nature remained motionless in a silent measurement of will. The darkness felt disturbed, and its shape reflected that unease. Unlike the calm, solid demeanor of the One, the darkness lashed out in place. Multiple versions of its own shape displayed many hollow images of agony and contained force which flailed and thrashed sadistically in place. Dark, misty tentacles whipped in random directions, getting tangled in themselves, while the intent to devour all was prominent in the mind of this hateful shadow. It understood that its strength had been matched. This assumption was nearly true, however. The One knew all too well that the evil had an advantage, a speck, just a minuscule more power than itself. Enough not to risk the fate of all it loved in a heroic battle. Just as the One feared the power it had created, the darkness too felt overwhelmed by this beacon of light. And so, a compromise was shared in silence. The two extended their fickle trust and held hands. A mute agreement was stated, and with that joining, the two split vertically in half. 4 figures now stood parallel. 2 halves of one whole being of light were side by side, mirrored by the 2 halves of one whole being of darkness. Each half then joined with its glaring opposite, thus merging as 2 separate figures once again. Each split down the middle, sharing equal parts pure and evil. With the antithesis coming together, all remaining outbursts of chaos had been soothed, and the vacant earth had its moment to rest. One of these 2 sprouted feathered wings and promptly rose to the sky. The other craned its neck and watched the distance grow between them. The being to remain on Earth was compacted entirely into a violet-gray ball made of swirling energy particles. The first new wind of the world carried these particles on a journey around the globe, bringing life back from desolation. Once all was restored, the remaining concomitant power distributed itself among millions of people and countless other forms of life on Earth. The being that rose above the Earth used the knowledge of these tears to create a unique rift, locating a ghost of the very first world it had created. A small pocket of infinitely looping space with no end or beginning that shined bright with the scale version of the world's sun at the center. Marble slabs and ivory structures remained from the days of material experimentation and were adapted as a new home to observe from. This place was called Nexus.
This audiobook is sponsored by Anchor, the best way for anyone to create audio content and make a little cash on the side. Worried your podcast isn't getting enough traffic to justify signing up? Well, don't, because Anchor is completely free, has creator tools for you to get started, and doesn't require a minimum listenership to start earning. Anchor distributes to Spotify, iTunes, Google, Overcast, Breaker, and many, many more podcasting sites, not to mention a custom RSS feed so you can share your show wherever you'd like. What are you waiting for? Sign up with Anchor today at anchor.fm.
A short period of time had passed, and in a moment of solitude, the being gazed down at Earth and saw humanity thriving once more. It could sense every emotion and was pleased to see that there was perfect harmony, good and evil alike. Then again, nothing is ever as simple as it seems. A history of failures loomed over the new deity. It cannot lapse. Human souls are not perfect, thus the experiment must continue. Although capable, it was a risk to control the ebb and flow of everything by its lonesome. Proper checks and balances must be applied to obtain desired results. Therefore, it split itself into 4 equal parts with the purpose of preservation and moderation. These 4 beings were identical, faceless, featureless. As years went on and interaction with mankind grew, the 4 noticed odd things beginning to occur. For some unexplained reason, they developed unique emotions and opinions. At first concerning, they soon realized the benefits of such a thing. In order to understand and grow with the world and its inhabitants, they must relate, speak the same language, in a sense. This advance caused the 4 to evolve from their blanket slates, each taking on a unique moniker and appearance. Composure was held with the drive of harmony being They quickly grasped that most of humanity was content with neutrality, keeping a healthy weight of good and evil within themselves, while merely observing the extremes. Inevitably, mankind was prone to war. With rising conflict and the negative dynamism spiking, the Four noticed severe changes within themselves. Their astral forms began to age, and the powers that granted them superiority weakened. And so they developed new laws to prevent one side from tipping the balance. A law that would allow them to strategically interfere and lessen the influence of whichever had expanded. The process of preservation grew more complex with every instance, and new laws continued to be written. With time, the Four fully grew into unique individuals, each responsible for specific powers and influences, and thus they were named. Amur, Jvalt, Akram, and Orin identified themselves as the Council. As they each evolved into their own identities, they quickly developed a set of rules and guidelines, specifically designed to bar any decision affecting themselves or the human world to be carried out by a single will. Each mission, each request, was to be written out and signed by all four members, then sealed by powerful magic that bound the one who would carry out the assignment. No exposure. In order to interact with the energy of any life form on Earth, they must, at the very least, leave Nexus. No member of the Council is to set foot in any other dimension without a direct order of manual cause from the Council. If a situation requires direct interaction, one where they are to descend and be in plain view of onlookers, a protective spell must be formed to mask their energy, as well as some cosmetic changes to better blend in, hiding such features as their white eyes and retracting their wings. A strict time limit is also given to anyone who leaves Nexus. The most important rule forbids the murder of any human unless it is part of the contract, and a human to be eliminated must be explicitly listed as a target. Lesser demons and fiends, on the other hand, can be eliminated, but only if they are a prominent threat to the mission. If a member kills any human without having an approved document containing all signatures, the offender's location will be revealed to the Council and divine intervention will take effect. What this means is any spell or enchantment that is in place to protect or hide the offender will be bypassed so that another member may attempt to subdue and retrieve them. This is not an ideal situation, as the Council may only have one member on Earth at a time. If any more than one Council member occupies Earth, their combined energy will cause catastrophic side effects. If any of these rules are broken, then the persecuted would have their powers sealed and they would await trial. Remaining members of the Council would then perform a ritual intended to lock down and reform their comrades' energy, shaping it into a new life form with a new identity, essentially resetting them with the hopes of wiping away anything that may have influenced the offender to turn against the Council. However, these laws were merely set just so they may exist, a precaution. Truth be told, every member is aware of their own limitations and how far they have fallen from the grace of their previous collected form. Though these ideas are in place, the confidence in their own power to perform such a transformation is thin. Never did they imagine anything like this could happen, seeing as they each had the same goal and were split evenly from a single being. They are identical pieces of one puzzle, and in all of the 1,000 years that they watched over Earth, never did any of the members show any signs of treason. They went on to create a collection of offensive, defensive, and passive spells and abilities that would be used to maintain balance. Things as mundane as the power to sprout plant life from barren soil, to erupting certain organs. Anything that perceived as useful for any future scenario was developed, recorded, and stored in their archive. In this culmination of knowledge, they kept hundreds and thousands of tomes, which held a record of everything since their creation. Most importantly, a detailed ledger of every single order discussed, requested, and carried out, as well as all of their results. Their rulebooks, every spellbook, and detailed overviews of each member, which listed every single character trait and ability, was kept perfectly organized. Amur was an exceptionally tall, beautiful woman with long and supple hair that flowed freely in the ever-still atmosphere of Nexus.
Eternally moving like a gentle river, her hair captured the wandering eyes of each onlooker with its bold red color during her few visits to Earth. Like a soft, glowing ember in the night, she emitted a maternal sense of warmth and security by simply existing. Her body was wrapped in a long, white and gold accented robe, convincing many naive humans into thinking she was an angel, though her attire is modified to meet the requirements of her mission. Based on appearance alone, Amur was the usual candidate for assignments on Earth that required a gentle approach, one where she could influence humans with her looks and not her powers. She could diffuse almost any hostile situation with the purpose of peace or deceit. That is not to say that she doesn't contain immense power like the rest of her family. They are all equal in raw strength, but it is their abilities and aptitude for handcrafted spells that sets them apart. She tends to favor spells that calm a situation over any means of conflict. That being said, when things require a less than subtle approach, she specializes in an offensive barrage of concentrated energy spheres. These orbs are extremely fast and agile, all precisely controlled by her hand and finger gestures, and carry with them a great explosive force. Juvalt is the odd one, exceptionally short and frail like a preteen, but a woman in physical structure. Easily overlooked, however, there is one thing about her that should always be feared. The sharp, empty stare of her eyes is one that without any words could make boasting men whimper and collapse from fear. Speculated to have received hostility and an unnatural resonance from the darkness itself, even the council feels uneasy by her presence. She is simple and quiet. Although she does not have much interest in spells, she does favor a select few. Primarily, her telekinetic abilities are employed equally as offensive and defensive. Her physical attacks can be amplified by telekinetically grabbing hold of her limbs and forcing them to hit harder with her mental influence. These aptitudes, she could compact a full-grown adult into the size of a matchbox in a matter of seconds, though the drain her telekinesis causes restricts just how much she can exploit. Aside from that, she is easily the fastest of the group and the most tenacious, having most of her missions centered around crowd control of fiends and upper-level demonic entities. Her experience in the battlefield makes her unpredictable and merciless. Combat aside, Juvalt has a deeper connection with the energies on Earth. This alignment can predict potential events based on the fluctuation of spiritual pressure in any person or persons, thus making her a prime consultant on how to prevent or enable disasters. Her range of focus is fairly limited, and thus she tends to consolidate her eyes on world leaders and populated cities. Akram stands bold with a grimacing stare and a high sense of superiority, a look of self-importance highlighted by his black suit with a red tie and clean haircut. Clear ambition radiates in his narrow eyes beneath a furrowed brow, seriousness and keen intent permanently angling his expression. Akram prides himself with the acquired knowledge, and he had perfected many of their spells as well as his own unique tricks. His innate abilities consisted of manipulation, planting ideas in people's heads or removing them if need be. He could take any fragment of an emotion and multiply it to the point of becoming the frontmost motivator of all of their actions, an obsession, or he could remove that emotion entirely. Akram's abilities made him quite useful for small operations and a key candidate for targets Juvalt classified. Setting a specific event in motion or adjusting a pre-existing arrangement to keep it on course were his usual tasks. Akram never set foot on Earth, even though his power to influence becomes stronger the closer he is to his target. His missions left him hovering above in the clouds where his power could still be used without the risk of exposure. On top of that, he scoffed at the very idea of sharing space with humans, who he viewed as such a lesser being. Now, Oren prides himself on proficiency and expertise. He is known among his family to be the busy one. In the beginning, he seldom left Nexus for field work, spending most of his time developing the spells that his family would use. He does not ever reveal a spell until it is perfected, assigned a glyph, and logged away in the appropriate scroll. Amor often acted as a sort of test dummy for his work. Seeing how she has mastered many defensive spells, Oren trusts her to deflect and critique whatever he comes up with little risk of harming her. Although, despite his array of offensive and defensive spells, he does not have any personal abilities and lacks direct experience in the field. His primary direct means of attack being that of the Council's weaponized relics. Relics are usually made by a follower of the Council's whim on Earth, a being whose spiritual energy and physical manifestation is the opposite to that of a demon. A small number of humans with such a pure will rise past humanity and become something enlightened, an acolyte. The role of these followers is to fight back against the spawn of evil, find and gather relics in the near realms, and acquire information about humans and fiends alike. In most situations, they focus their efforts on safeguarding children without directly influencing their outlook unless specifically directed by the Council. Taking the mantle of biblical angels or whatever religiously significant powers are respected, instilling those positive traits and moral ideas in the next generation. Now, buried in the Council's archives was minimal information on human souls. This subject was taboo amongst the Council. As a whole, they understood that human souls were a construct of the collapse which predated their lives. The basics of how they influenced a person, how much raw energy a soul contained, and various wide-known facts were all well known by each member. But things like how they were made and what exactly makes one are ignored and forbidden to seek. As part of keeping balance, the Council allowed evil beings such as demons and fiends of lore to roam the earth, although their presence was never to be widely recognized. To provide an opposite to demons naturally, they gave strength to priests and spiritual people who would then take on secret roles to combat rampant demons. These people were a step below acolytes, but not necessarily weaker. They were known as exorcists. The Council did not have complete power and rule overall. They themselves had an opposite, an equalizer, as the second being from their resurrection remained on the soil and brought life back to Earth. The leftover power was absorbed deep underground. Its purpose was the same as the pockets of energy originally dispersed in the planet's early cycles. Just as the one first intended, it gathered natural energy from those who passed on, using the remaining life force to fuel the planet itself and continue its growth, despite what humanity might do to pollute and ravage it. Unfortunately, history tends to repeat itself. A new faction of demons and fiends born from wretched desires and hatred joined together in secrecy. Once again, they discovered the growing energy as it vibrated beneath the surface. They pillaged and tainted this energy and purged it of its pure half, allowing the vile, unfiltered darkness to mutate them into something not of this world. Merging together such as the past predicts, a new powerful group of demons breathed life, and with their birth came the knowledge of their own past. Aware of the Council and the result of mutiny, they chose not to reveal themselves. Instead, they used their knowledge to locate a forbidden tear between dimensions. Driven by controlled chaos and lust for vengeance against the One, they took refuge in Underworld. The pure percentage of the orb was drastically weakened, not entirely snuffed, and lingered away from its resting place, finding a new place to nest and continue its work high above the ground. Directly between Earth and the sun's rays blasted through the orb, carrying its life force into all the plants and oceans. Consequentially, relinquished of its opposite half, it could not gather and distribute energy from negative spirits. Instead, only the pure beings were collected and redistributed. Now that it gathered only purity, it also emitted unique rays, empowering the acolytes and exorcists alike. Those who sought refuge in the darkness and passed on from their lives were allowed passage into the underworld, carried endlessly through the river Styx, and forever tortured. Their suffering gave life to new monsters and empowered evil inversely to the light. As soon as they were established and the split in the ancient power occurred, they began to grow their forces, revealing their identity to the other creatures hiding in the shadows, all coming together to offset the balance once more. This time, the dark forces would not make peace with the light. They began to interfere with humanity by spreading their vile hatred into the hearts of mankind, creating murderers, rapists, and immoral offenders. Paranoia and fear were rampant throughout all living minds, and it didn't take long for the council to notice the sudden shift. They felt this new energy and recognized the pattern. Now, they had a bigger role to play. While also maintaining the natural balance of mankind, they also had to combat the presence of new demons cropping up all over the place, occasionally leaving Nexus to eliminate the minor threats. To add even more chaos to the ongoing power struggle, there were demons that held their own agenda, ones that acted indifferently between light and dark. The King of the Crossroads demon had two powerful items that allowed him to make deals for souls, these items being an infinite scroll and an amulet. The scroll allowed him to acquire human souls after 5 years of making a deal. Their souls were connected to the scroll through the ink they used to sign their names and stored there, while the amulet granted him the ability to perform small miracles to accommodate the requests of humans. Working alongside the king were two small factions of fiends. One group was known as Grell, a collection of thieving, underhanded fiends who wore the skin of humans, collecting many things to be sold through their black market. Information, tomes of powerful spells, and even human slaves. Anything worth a hefty price to a being of evil was worth selling here. The other faction was an even smaller group of philosophical fiends that went by the name Skilo. This group bartered souls from the king in order to study them. Any and all information they found was categorically stored in books and scrolls that they would then sell off for tools and favors. However, the process of studying the soul was tremendously problematic. They knew almost nothing about how they were made, how they operate, and how to handle them. Properly storing them was impossible without special items and spells. Many discovered firsthand the consequence of recklessly tinkering with the soul. The raw energy of one without proper storage, i.e., a living body, was tremendously unstable. Among all the forming chaos in the blind eye of humanity, none was so destructive to the balance of these worlds as a traitor within. One member of the council was not so perfect as the rest. The split of power that gave each of them life was not completely even. There was a fraction of a tiny percentage of additional evil energy at the very core of his being. This near insignificant amount of non-discernible malice grew. Over the 1,000 years since their birth, it had become something not so easily ignored. It acquired authority over the mind and emotions of this beacon of neutrality. Akram was the second coming of the darkness. He watched over mankind in a different way, and more often than the others. He kept especially close attention to the King of Crossroads and his habitual soul-stealing. The council had not yet interfered because what he was doing was not tipping the balance in any significant way. He was smarter than that. Over a few short years, Akram developed a small obsession with the shivering flurries of human essence. It was strange to him. It drove him mad. The thought that their own makeup at the core was derived from human souls, but they did not resonate. The energy was so familiar but entirely different, at least from what he could see. The souls were sacred and almost a religious icon to the council, and as the evil within him grew and grew, the less sense it all made. Why not acquire a few souls, experiment to better understand it all? Why avoid learning how is it that one soul, one human of such integrity and compassion, can become vile and destructive by a single event? How does it infect other minds and corrupt their very being? And how does one such being of evil become purified? Human souls, at the end of the day, were nothing shy of a magnificent mystery that had to be studied. Then another thought burrowed its way into his mind. As they understood, their exact makeup is near identical to a soul. Thus, who is to say that power cannot be harnessed once more and applied to his own strength? Perhaps he could become strong enough to create his own version of life. Akram spent so much time watching them in silence that his habits caught the attention of his brother Oren. He approached Akram with a kind greeting, but his eyes quickly turned hollow as he examined his brother's dried-out face, relentlessly glaring through the clouds with a look of insanity. Oren expressed concern for his brother, and the response he received was a question spoken with a deep gravel tone of voice. A question regarding human souls that ended with a statement envying the king below. Orin was shocked, but kept calm. When he asked Akram the purpose behind these questions, he received one word as an answer. Akram turned to face his brother, hair looking disheveled and eyes seemingly gray. He muttered, "Curiosity," and then walked away. Akram was no fool. The very next day after getting some rest, he looked back on his actions with trepidation. By the look on his brother's face, it was clear that his family did not share this notion. In fact, ever since this seed of curiosity was planted in his belly, he felt more and more segregated from them. His desires would have to remain secret. But that itch he felt rampantly spread like a plague under his skin. Infected by nightmares and visions of a mysterious misty blob spewing tendrils and screaming across the land, he experienced fear and a voice. Akram placed a spell over himself to mask this blanket of darkness that layered over his core and indulged in the horror visions. Soon after, Akram desperately called a meeting. Standing before the council, somewhat disheveled and vacant, he requested the gate be open for a reconnaissance mission. Orin shared a concerned look with his peers, and Amur responded with questions. What was the purpose of a scouting mission? Which side does it serve? Akram collected himself, poised and seemingly genuine, to which he responded, personal interest in a demon he has been watching. Skeptical, but having no reason to distrust their brother thus far, the council approved. It was, of course, a good lie. Granted 1 hour in the sky only, no interaction, no landing, and absolutely no use of his power. Nothing besides a 1-hour sweep and reading of energies from above. Anything more would have to be requested after he returns, provided he gathered information warranting further action. And so, a contract was written and laid out on a podium before the gate. As each member approached the contract to imbue it with the signature of energy, Orin was the last to approach. Stalling before the page, he looked to his brother with distrust forming. Akram noticed his shifty eyes and gave him a peculiar stare, standing with his chin raised high and his eyes angled low, peering down at his brother's face. Trembling, a grin slipped from his stoic face at the very moment Orin had granted permission. Akram cleared his throat, and the grin diminished, thanking everyone individually with a shrill texture to his voice. He gave his sisters a heartfelt smile and Orin a final glance. Amur's hair had begun blowing in the wind as the gate prepared to open. They gathered at the gate, the one and only portal to the human world, and watched as he stepped through and fell from the sky. The instant he slipped past the barrier, his wings erupted from his back and allowed him to hover just on the other side. Spinning around, legs dangling and arms taut by his side, he shot a victorious sneer back at his family. A pulse of decadent energy pushed them away from the gate as he unleashed a surge of potent evil from his core. Javault, the ever-stoic one, braced herself with a furious scowl as the realization washed over their skin. Before they could do anything about it, Akram initiated a spell that he had been working on in secret. A beam of white light exploded from his chest, crashing into the empty space between the pillars that outlined the gate. In that space, a transparent wall was formed, which Javault immediately lunged for, only to be thrown back several feet and knocked unconscious. A sigil spawned in the center of this flowing energy barrier, created from roughly half of his own power and locked in place by a special seal that the council had no means of breaking. Once the seal had been placed, the string that connected Akram snapped, freeing this heretic from a world he once knew. The instant his power was split down the middle and the seal was set, his wings were set ablaze. The rushing wind quickly shredded the fragile feathers as he rapidly descended upon the earth. He knew there would be setbacks, mysteries to encounter, as something like this was never done before. But he was not prepared to fall from such a height with hardly a means to protect himself from the impact. Fear rattled his system as the ground became visible. Acting fast, Akram made an attempt to use a spell which would form a barrier around his body to absorb the impact, but he was too weak. Unintentionally, a thick, tainted smog spat out of his body, catching fire from the building heat and static discharge around him. Unable to slow himself and hardly able to stay conscious, he braced himself for impact. This audiobook is sponsored by Anchor, the best way for anyone to create audio content and make a little cash on the side. Worried your podcast isn't getting enough traffic to justify signing up? Well, don't, because Anchor is completely free, has creator tools for you to get started, and doesn't require a minimum listenership to start earning. Anchor distributes to Spotify, iTunes, Google, Overcast, Breaker, and many, many more podcasting sites, not to mention a custom RSS feed so you can share your show wherever you'd like. What are you waiting for? Sign up with Anchor today at anchor.fm.
The name Sin was not granted nor chosen. It was a moniker fated to be, a grand departure from all he was expected to uphold and previously defended, a name to clearly define him, one that would bring dreadful connotation to all who were unfortunate enough to acquaint themselves. Introducing himself as such to the bleeding, scarred, and broken girl, he himself was faced by an immediate decision. The misfortune of his dramatic falter to earth cast a consuming flame which interrupted a hateful suburban crime in progress. A vengeful soul driven to murder had eradicated this young girl's family, but was interrupted by the catastrophic downfall. The assailant escaped, a man, but the girl had been pinned by the crumbling home engulfed in mystical fire. Thus, Sin was burdened by her survival. The seal which he created to keep the council from entering this plane would be broken the moment this girl dies, as it was his mystical energy that imbued the flames that were sapping her life. And so he had no choice but to siphon his own god energy to empower the mortal, granting her despondent survival. Heavily weakened by so much of his own vigor lost so quickly, energy that would not simply regenerate for nearly 3/4 had been given away in total. Desperate to rest and plan his next moves, he stole the semi-mortal girl and relinquished himself to a tear in this world. An unknown time passed where he recovered. In this time, the girl had awoken, unable to move and rapidly spouting questions, incoherently stifling the immeasurable agony that ravaged her inside and out, her mind and soul struggling to determine what was reality and what was her overbearing nightmares from the trauma. She received an answer as to how she survived, though her fickle human mind choked on the word of godly magics. The very concept of such, combined with Sin's expository description of what this world is and where he came from, dragged her down into a pit of despair. Infinite questions kept her conscious far longer than she should have been most days. All the while, her very soul became conjoined with the energy he had gifted. At last, she gave her name to the petulant god, Christine. The burden of fate and mangling of her soul dragged the poor girl into the depths of madness. He built a cage, prison bars imbued with a rudimentary spell to keep her contained, for he had no understanding of how the situation would unfold. For weeks, she was locked away, unable to move as she suffered terrible pain. Unlike himself, accelerated healing, mystical prowess, and attribute increases were not present in this time of acclimation. His power served only to fuel her life, not empower it. She suffered in darkness, stricken by all which devastated her mental state in near isolation. The horrors that preceded his descent still agonizingly fresh.
Sin studied how her body and mind responded to this godly power, while doing everything he could to soothe her pain. Using minor healing spells to numb the flesh, which at times was rejected by his own energy as it circled around in her body in hysteria. Watching her deteriorate, Sin understood time was short, and a new solution must be found. In rare moments of stillness within the bars, Christine conversed with the fallen god. Her festering burns crusted and peeling, the two quickly established a connection, a bond. One that grew dependent from her point of view as the memories of how she got here coagulated as one hellish nightmare. Reality, to her, was no longer linear. Sin too confided in her, sharing his own affliction and the details of a far-forgotten past where the realm nearly collapsed. The concept of multiple dimensions overlapping this one and how they can be traversed with proper technique, venting as he came to terms with his actions and consequences. In the same regard, Christine shared her life story to the best of her memory, finding her words accepted and emotions understood by this old man. Stories of her childhood, aspirations, and disparities. Everything she could muster, when she could, was shared. In those few weeks, the two became almost family, a new daughter and her mentor. Though they shared firm sentiments, Christine continued to express her pain, her anger, and a fear of falling asleep. A fear of the darkness that shrouded them. It was cold and unforgiving, kept at bay by the single candlelight that flickered like fleeting hope. Their conversation began to dwindle as Christine's own voice became forfeit. Oftentimes when she slept in those weeks, Sin would slip away from this little pocket dimension they resided in. This fragment of a shattered dark world hidden beneath layers of other similar rooms from different palettes. He explored, inserting himself among humanity where he could observe their behaviors, read their souls, and discover hidden energies within the wind, indulge in the presence he feels so far above. Having such knowledge and a keen natural awareness to the relics his very own acolytes crafted and discovered, he soon sought out the weapons. Not only that, he spent much time journaling his interactions and all information he gathered on existing fiends, factions, and relics. Quickly amassing a library of books he had written, bartered for, and acquired by mysterious means, Sin established what would become the basis for his wealth of knowledge, fueling the obsession further. Intimately focused, his shelves continued to fill, a number of which, not so easily dismissed, were adorned by relics and other mystical items he swiftly acquired, though he knew this was only the beginning. The more relics he obtained, the less could be used against him. The more time he spent wandering and collecting, researching, the more time Christine spent alone with her pain and deteriorating thoughts. Months of near total absence, and Sin finally returned to her. That isn't to say he didn't closely supervise her life force, as he understood what her death would mean, though, in the blindness of his outings, he failed to notice the underlying changes occur. Entering the blackened domicile, he discovered the girl sitting upright. Amazed, he approached the cage to check her wounds, but her docile composure was anything but. She lunged at the bars, bending them significantly with the impact of her limp shoulder. Her fleshy burns unhealed and dripping to the floor as a thick puddle of red. She chomped and snarled, attempting to reach between the bars with her right eye wide open, glowing that same rotted yellow as his own. He could sense it. At the very center of what she had become with the inclusion of his power, she was unique. The spell he used to steal half of his power into the gate to keep it closed, that etching burned into his own remaining life force, was not present in this child.
The womb of destiny bore a being not bound to his godly contract. As far as he understood, this creature, as she was now, could kill without unsheathing the wrath of his family, without nullifying his bond and breaking the contract that sealed the gate shut. A heated, potent energy rose from the cage, parallel to her increasing anger. That power built and built until it exploded outward in a tidal wave of invisible ire. That surge dissolved the cage to dust, unleashing her fury with a thunderous animal cry. Acting fast, he conjured a spell from thin air and put her in a stasis. Subdued, she collapsed to the floor, sloshing in a pool of her own blood. On guard, Sin approached the girl with a saddened posture. Guilt, but not for her humanity. With the short time he allotted, Sin began construction on a new cage. Most particles mixed with significant magic and nearby relics that he forged into a new powerful container. Identical as the one before, but this time, he shrouded the bars in total blackness. A cloud of pulsing smoke to conceal her, guarding temperament when she would surely rise again. This chamber was entirely imbued with methodic melodies in mind, little chimes of lulling noises to quell the chaos in her mind, to keep her attached to something mentally. At first, he mourned the girl, assuming her humanity had been corrupted to the point of insanity. However true in a sense, he did not realize the deeper truth behind her new existence. Christine, as she was, existed in a sweltering pool of her deepest regrets, trapped in an endless nightmare that never failed to surpass previous torture. Every horrid emotion and memory was baked into her very core, derived from the events which she had survived. The family she watched die, the insurmountable regret and loss she felt, constantly reforming as a new monster inside, intent on burying the girl in a plague of insanity. Her uncontrolled hunger aside, the gifted power within seemed to be keeping her alive well enough. But her new life was not what he expected. While she lingered in the box, he studied her soul and logged away any taboo information he could in various journals. While he studied and notarized, he repeatedly told stories to her subconscious, recounting once again his family back in Nexus and their own origin, as far as he could remember. A therapeutic exposition to sort out the chaos of his own mind while sharing valuable information with one that he assumed would either not retain or perhaps be used to reawaken. In his many trips to Earth and Underworld, Sin had slowly amassed alchemic equipment and technologies for construction, brewing, and enchanting. Anything he could possibly need for whatever experiment he deemed necessary to carry out and study. With his growing knowledge of simple potions and the gossip he memorized, he was easily able to trade wisdom and brew magics in exchange for these tools. With the tools and skills he acquired, he dissected her soul. In this, Sin made a profound discovery. That her personal, human soul had been weakened, corporeally shredded, and filtered by the extreme trauma she endured. Nearly half of what it once was, while a third of his own power occupied a fraction of that empty space. It was no wonder why her mind collapsed. Despite her apparent physical recovery state, it was clear that his own power was consuming her.
This audiobook is sponsored by Anchor, the best way for anyone to create audio content and make a little cash on the side. Worried your podcast isn't getting enough traffic to justify signing up? Well, don't, because Anchor is completely free, has creator tools for you to get started, and doesn't require a minimum listenership to start earning. Anchor distributes to Spotify, iTunes, Google, Overcast, Breaker, and many, many more podcasting sites, not to mention a custom RSS feed so you can share your show wherever you'd like. What are you waiting for? Sign up with Anchor today at anchor.fm.
With that unearthing, Sin understood that to preserve this child, the void must be filled. An artificial soul must be introduced to act as a stabilizer. And so, Sin returned to Earth to think. He vaguely understood the restrictions and raw power behind a soul, knowing well enough that forceful extraction would cause a meltdown of its very structure and force a collapse of energy powerful enough to level a city block. Earth would not be able to provide such. Therefore, his only hope was Underworld, and time was running short. In his time waiting between planes, there was a fiend he came to know as Mupas, a scraggly coward with a charming aloofness that had grown fond of Sin's visits to various bazaars. The thought of Mupas reminded him of the fiend's side work, a courier of sorts to many upper underworld residents, including the Lords of Court. The Lords of Court were monstrous beings born from the crag and soot of Underworld after soaking in twisted damned souls for hundreds of years. Small coagulations adapted intelligence by observation and the deceased's own previous lives. Juvalt had kept a close eye on these two, and an incomplete profile was written. The Lords were more or less hellish politicians that exploited the black market and shadow bazaars as a means to establish an empire in the rut. Generally speaking, they were no powerful threat to Sin or the Council, but their influence and roots, secrets, and connections were something to watch closely. Apart from the Lords, Mupas had spoken of his time spent traveling to a particular location, a secret. By chance, Sin had befriended the only fiend with access to the split of energy stolen by evil. That primeval energy that recycled death and distributed life, the eternal cycle, is now in the care of one who was vaguely described as the Watcher of the Dead. Entering Underworld and seeking out his connection Mupas, Sin was guided to that secret location deep in the bowels of this hellscape, accessible to those with a physical form only through a special key, a key bound to the flesh of few. Mupas, given his duties, peeled back the skin of his hand and the bones reformed into a mangled prodding device, then inserted crookedly, and the chains of this door fumbled to the crag. He entered alone with purpose. Charisma would be his only weapon, though it became well apparent that hostility was not a concern. In this dungeon decorated by seemingly infinite mummified carcasses constructing the very walls, a black pond of indeterminable size lay still in the center. At the edge, a hunched, cloaked figure stood gazing into the abyss. Sin respectfully introduced himself to the Watcher of the Dead, and the Watcher responded with a name, Charon. The mysterious being revealing himself as nothing more than a rotten corpse. Skin dry, flaking and tight, a hole in his chest where a small glowing orange bulb whispered and pulsated. The hollow sockets of eyes screamed deceit and truth equally. This chamber resounded, effervescently simulating a nostalgic burn that swelled his iridescent vigor. Longing for the touch of his family so far away slowed his mind. Memories of the past millennia choked down his throat and digested. His attention was held by the pool of ethereal shapes swirling like bundles of hair and flesh in a coursing river. The edges of this pool foamed and clapped against the stone. A haunting whispering drew him nearer. He knew right away that this water was preserving the damned souls until their time of recycling. Sin was quick to the point, addressing the liquid as his key interest at this moment. It was then that he was treated to a story of the ancient sphere from the perspective of Underworld. At the time, it was an untouchable power that granted them structure and mind, a religious icon sacred to their cycle as wrought life. Underworld worshipped this pillaged thing from a time and source they have no concept of, unlike him. Collectively, they named it De Virtu. Sin noted this in his thoughts so that he may transfer it to paper later. Intrigued, he realized now he must tread carefully as not to upset the zealots. A bargain was set in place to acquire a moderate sample, in exchange a favor that was not yet disclosed. Understanding the weight behind such a mysterious asking, Sin begrudgingly remained stoic, equally mistrusting. However, in the end, his ambition was more important than his fear, and so they shook. Satisfied and eager, he swiftly departed with his container of liquid, leaving the proverbial door open to more interaction in the future. Upon returning home, he ran appropriate tests over a few days. As he had hoped, the water had acclimated to the De Virtu in such a way to preserve disembodied souls, a trait that persisted even after contact with the source had been taken away. However, these properties eventually weakened, forcing him to return for more. However, during his trials, undenounced to Sin, acolytes that remained on Earth when he fell had begun dealing information with Underworld without revealing the exact situation. An acolyte named Yuhi had been watching Mupas and recognized Sin despite his elder skin. There were only a few acolytes who were capable of a psychic connection, and soon after Sin fell, Javalt revealed this connection to the rest of the council and established a link with Yuhi among others. After Yuhi interrogated Mupas when Sin left, under the threat of annihilation, she passed her findings on to Javalt. When they confirmed Sin's presence and mysterious actions, every acolyte apart from those with a psychic link were sent into hiding. It wasn't for another few visits to the bazaar that Sin noticed how clearly shaken the lowly devil had become. Torn between two threats on his life if he were to speak, Mupas struggled with who to protect in order to protect himself. Evidently, Sin's darker aura and impassive persistence convinced him to reveal the acolyte's watching eyes. Delaying his objective, Sin immediately became internally furious, but not entirely at Mupas, though he noted the betrayal. Standing in the bazaar, Sin expanded an invisible scanning wave of energy through the surrounding area. A lonesome ping caught his attention, and he discovered the acolyte. Swiftly taking hold of this middle-aged woman dressed in silk robes, Sin paralyzed her with his godly stare and dragged her through a portal. She was taken back to his chamber, and he had the chance to execute a particularly sickening spell. A torturous affliction that spread energy under the skin and separated it from the flesh, then swelling out just enough to pull the skin off the meat without tearing. When retracted, that same energy mended the peeled skin on its way out, returning the afflicted to normal. That was the idea, anyway. Given his inexperience with this type of magic, his amateurism was plain to see. As a result, Yuhi suffered terrible hemorrhaging and stress lacerations, forcing Sin to retract the spell early. That hideous endeavor was more than enough for Yuhi to confirm her secret mission. She lay on the floor, broken and distant. The gravity of this crime halted him, distancing his mind and infecting him with a barrage of memories of corrupt influence. With this information roadblocking his plans, Sin was forced to pivot his actions. The rising complications and a wave of seething anger reignited. He opened the cage and allowed the murderous Christine to strip the flesh off Yuhi's bones. Her terrible human screams echoed in this small chamber while he watched with glowing eyes. Later, retrieving the devoured mess, he plucked the blessed core and transmogrified it into a powerful relic, carefully molding it into an iron sphere wrapped in thick chains, a living container for a new experiment. That night, he tediously modified this relic for a unique purpose, pouring all sorts of magic into the shell and breaking down previous relics to enhance the spell he cast within the iron. One final test. A door was opened from nothing, and he stepped inside. Where he stood now was outside the bounds of many realities, connected to nothing but the void. Eternally stretching and yet bound to physicality, the walls, ceiling, and floor that contained him did little to assuage his keen observation of the nothing beyond, but he was not afraid. It was exactly as he designed, a large room of crag and darkness with an empty pond at the center. Admittedly, a crude recreation of Charon's residence, but with a purpose far beyond simple recycling. He exited this tiny realm and bound these notes to paper, recounting the events recently past and compiling all the information he had on the acolytes, the pond water, and his custom relic. Pausing, he approached the cage where a huffing, perpetually starving Christine stood, painted red. Something in him shifted. He could feel the writhing, the conflict of Akram buried beneath layers of blinding evil, the snuff of who he had been before making the plunge, all for a purpose he didn't truly understand. Flashes of that cataclysm broadened his mind and reintroduced him to the ends he trekked for, a spiteful journey for vengeance against the One. The regret of his own life and the immeasurable pain that part of him felt so long ago, everything the One created deserves to perish for simply existing. His chest ached, and the girl behind the bars was the first hurdle to annihilation. That he understood. He conversed with the unresponsive, laying out the ideas he had been considering. His plan was thought out, but not backed by a lot of research. Fickle, at best, until he could further hypothesize through experimentation. As of now, he knew that in order to stabilize this girl for her survival, he would need to introduce a variable to balance her human soul in his own power. Meaning, he would need more souls to match that of his own. Therein lies a glaring issue. Acquiring souls is impossibly difficult without murder and shredding it to little pieces. As fate would have it, there are many ways, none so easily exploited but not entirely inaccessible to someone like him. He knew exactly who to visit and what he was looking for. He departed once again, this time in search of a particular archfiend he had learned of in the bazaars. This breed of demon was not so easily concealed, as there were only a few alike. An archfiend that not only survived the splicing of his creation, but escaped captivity and continued to grow in his intelligence. His story was well known, even to the council, though admittedly shallow. With a few nudges in the right direction, Sin was directed to the one he sought. Atop a high-rise overlooking the magma fields outside of the favela that was Fiend territory, he met with the archfiend Faustus, retired King of the Crossroads. A behemoth in every sense of the word, this monster wielded two items to carry out his old work, an infinite scroll that he tore and shared among subordinates some time ago, and a peculiar obol. The scroll bound the soul of whoever signed it to whatever deal that was made, while the obol would link their soul to wherever he destined it to go, that being de virtu or a potential buyer. Faustus cared not for the souls himself, rather what he could get in exchange. Those transactions were ever elusive to the public eye. Wasting no time, the intent behind this contact was made known, a bargain for the obol. However, Faustus was quick to refuse any sort of arrangement, offering a deplorable and detailed threat as a rebuttal. The king had been inquired for hundreds of years prior and faced many threats against his life, or so he explained. Retired as he may be, simply handing over such powerful items to the elder was not an option. Sin's charisma had reached an end, and frustration with the back and forth grew. The petulant king, mocking his appearance and questioned his vague purpose, trudged up a knotted emotion deep inside. Patience lost, Sin then challenged the king. A fight to settle who would have the power he boasts. Faustus, having no indication of Sin's true identity, guffawed at the idea. Given Archfiend's reputation in the underworld, the idea that this fragile-looking human could best him in any form of combat was audacious to the point of pity. Still, he accepted, overconfident and ignorant. There in his mausoleum, a raging battle took place. At first, Sin toyed with the beast, testing his agility and raw strength. The exhilaration of fresh battle seduced him so much that he stretched it out nearly 30 minutes. The king used every trick he had, from full frontal assault to conjuring familiars of late devils to fight alongside him, ever growing fearful of the surprises the elder had in store. The surrounding magma field that defended his abode like a moat became an extension of his attacks through magic. Sin easily evaded spewing lava and rampaging spiritual husks, dispelling them and casting the liquid rock aside. Finally bored of this blitz, Sin opted to finish the fight in a single attack. The darkness within aroused to the point of carnage. Sin unleashed a wave of suffocating smoke that encapsulated the behemoth in a prism of mangled fear. His screams deafened by the thick veil until the shape collapsed in on his body. Crushed, Faustus hit the ground in a messy pile of bone and blood, alive. Hardly winded, Sin demanded the obol or the cost would be his life. A bluff. Faustus, teetering on the edge of consciousness, submit and handed over the mystical item, ashamed of this encounter. With a sneer and a bow, Sin flicked the coin in the air and caught it in his palm, turning away to depart. Now with the coin and what he decidedly had named the ditch in his possession, the next step was to acquire souls safely. For that he returned right away to Charon, and there he was greeted in kindness, as the two ancient beings shared a short reprieve from the tumultuous cycle. A question of the burns and disheveled hair was put to rest with a sly explanation, but Charon remained vigilant and skeptical. The two lingered in blissful commonplace, silently taking in the stillness while damned souls hummed in the background. It was abundantly clear that this was not just a visit. Still, the husk waded through the fragile tension and spoke. He shared faint sentiment for their time together, relating it to the fleeting souls in a seemingly endless spiral until they form anew. Charon admitted in solidarity their time bonded was short and conditional, but nonetheless cherished. Sin nodded in agreement, while Charon continued his verse. Stark loneliness and isolation had been mute at his arrival, a yearning for something different than idling here for eternity. The withered being's stressed ambition for an unknown future resonated with what Sin felt deep inside. Both stuck in some cosmic shackles, the only difference is that Sin was wriggling towards freedom while Charon nestled deeper. Unfortunately, an attachment was something he refused to accept anymore, for he had one too many beings under his care when there should be none. A decision made painfully in haste, Sin made a request for a larger sample of the pool, one containing a sum of spiraling souls within the liquid. Now Charon viewed him in a dangerous light, as the weight of what he was asking settled in the molded core. His vague emotions bled into the very air they breathed, unsettled by this and wholly aware of the old man's blazing energy. He seemed different now. Not a question was asked, as Sin held out the iron-cast orb. Sensing the growing malicious intent, Charon complied with a frown, and the last ounce of fleeting empathy dried. That bond they briefly shared, the understanding and acceptance, had faded. The pool inside the ditch was filled with 100 corrupted lives, and Sin was smugly on his way. No thank you or goodbye. Nearly a month had passed, of constant tiresome experimentation. These agitated energies proved difficult to control and blend, along with the constant distraction of Christine's horrid bellows of pain. He felt sadness, pressure, not only to keep her alive for his own sake before her own. He had no choice but to find determination in his work. Finally, tirelessly, after all of his hard work and stacks of notes, he arrived at an apparent solution. Persistent modification of the pond water and the contaminated souls within at last produced something tangible. The souls within crystallized, merging together as one solid mass, palm-sized and jagged, emitting a brown and black dusty glow from the center of its near-translucent form. This was the culmination of his hard work. It took a majority of the souls, refined into one single energy source, to become alive, thinking, starving. Anxious, he approached her box with a stone in hand, and immediately she darted to the back wall, creating as much distance as she could from the opaque hostility. It would seem some part of her rejected the crystal. A risk to simply thrust the stone upon her with such a violent mixture of differing vigor keeping her alive. And so, a trial was in order.
Within a day of removing the gem from the pool, a thin crack formed on the surface. An errant flaw, to be sure, but also an indicator of an unknown feature. A search was underway. For this magical stone to be perfected, he must run another set of experiments. The priority now was to find a human host, fuse the stone with their soul, and study what happens next. A hazardous endeavor, but a necessary one to further her chances. He spent days in the human world searching for a test subject. His hopes were to take a human with abnormal purity, a direct counter to the abundance of negativity that created this gem. Adults were untrustworthy and tainted by their time spent alive, which led him to the lower part of that totem. Early one morning, as he walked a lonesome street, he sensed something extraordinary, powerful but unrefined, special in a way no human could see or value. He followed that concentrated source blindly, like a beacon, leading him to a house in the middle of a cul-de-sac neighborhood. Submerging himself in shadows, he infiltrated the abode and observed the family within to root out this feeling. The mother appeared simple enough, as did the father, going about their trivial lives without a unique aspect about them. But the young daughter was entirely unique. Still asleep in her bed, tucked warmly in her footy pajamas, with messy hair and a precious dreaming smile, she clutched in her tiny fingers a plush doll. An impeccable glow trickled from her skin, something visible only to those with the predisposition. The 8-year-old girl named Melody Sinclair, untainted by the harsh realities of this world and spiritually clean. He had found a test subject. Formulating a plan which would allow him to take her away and gain her trust in doing so, for fear of her spirit wavering, he remained concealed and stayed close to the family. Early in the day, the family went for a walk, skipping along the sidewalk until they reached a playground nearby. The child was allowed to roam and play to her heart's content while the parents found a nearby bench to sit and talk. He waited patiently for the perfect moment. Over an hour had passed, and it was time to strike. Sin moved in quickly and cast a spell on the parents. This powerful illusion subverted the minds of whomever he selected and forced them to recreate ghost images of the intended as if they were real, perceived to exist before their eyes as a recreation from memory. Their false daughter convinced them to go home. The spell wasn't permanent, as it needed a constant flow of energy to fuel the illusion, but he did not need forever. Lost in the sea of children, Melody continued to play, unaware that her parents were a mile towards home without her. He took their seat on the bench, visible to all as just a frail old man in a black suit and bowler hat. He waited, with clasped hands and a weariness on his face. In time, as the other children were pulled away and the park had mostly cleared, Melody returned to the bench. There, she found Sin, waiting with a friendly smile and inviting eyes. Naturally, she asked where her parents had gone. Her innocence swelled in his chest, and a persona he had never exuded before took over. A kindness, separated from the banter with demons and divulgence with Christine. Sounding almost sincere, Sin offered his assistance in finding the girl's family. At this delicate age, and in this neighborhood, Melody had almost no skepticism. Jeering, a big smile peeled across her face. She took his hand, and together they walked. By now, the parents had gotten home with the figment, and that mysterious headache from his influence would begin to subside. He had to escape quickly, but do so in a way that would not frighten her. Looking down at the child, he suggested that he may have seen her parents nearby. The uplifted spirit of hers had been drained by his very presence. Tired and mind becoming foggy, she held his hand loosely and nodded along with his suggestion. Within a blink, the space their bodies cut through suddenly changed into the humid, monotonous space he called home. They stopped in the center, Sin with a satisfied smile split across its face, and Melody turning her head in confusion. Nervous, the child exhibited fear and protested, but when she turned to face him with tears in her eyes, he unveiled the little doll she clung to earlier that morning. Her face lit up at the sight of her favorite toy, and she embraced it tightly. A cynical snort exposed his intent, a detail unnoticed by the girl. He placed a gentle hand on her upper back, saying he wished to show her something extraordinary. Slyly guiding her towards a door in the wall directly beside Christine's domain, a room he constructed during breaks of experimentation. Distracted by her toy, she moved forward by his will and entered the heavy iron door, blissfully unaware of the predicament she found herself in. Inside was a similar dark room without windows and without a place to lie apart from a tattered cloth on the cold stone floor. In reality, the dungeon room lacked any sort of light or color, but in the child's eyes, it was disguised as her bedroom. Fooled by her own naivete and a small amount of magical influence by his hand, she entered her room, excited to be home at last. Calling for her mother and father, she hopped in a circle at the center of the room, only to stop as she faced the door where she was met by the sight of Sin, stoic and callous. The illusion wavered as his twisted grin widened. The bleeding darkness crept in closer, and that vision of home faded away, and the look on her face became dejected and horrified. Building tears and fear unlike anything she'd ever felt had overcome her, and she clutched the doll tighter for safety. From that grip came a dusty purple glow that resonated with her own soul. Glancing down at the toy, hoping to find comfort, instead, she was instantly stricken with terror as the doll morphed. A glowing purple stone larger than her hand sank into her skin like melted wax. Petrified, she attempted to scream, but only a raspy burst of dry air came out as her body went into some magical shock. The light crept up her arm, turning at the shoulder and braiding around her neck until it settled behind her eyes. At that moment, she collapsed onto the floor and Sin shut the door. Immediately, he slapped both hands against a painted sigil and activated the prepared enchantment, a spell he had worked to reuse any exploited assets of the souls from the river and use that life force to fuel her survival, empowering the body and stone alike until she could stabilize. Sliding a window panel on the door, he looked into the blackened room and watched her fragile body start to contort and vibrate, expressing horrible screams and cries for the family that so recently had forgotten her. Over and over, she called for her mother, pleading to be released to go home. But Sin only watched and took mental notes of the travesty that would follow. A transformation took place. Before his eyes, the girl's body underwent significant altercations never thought possible in a human with such an unadulterated soul. Almost immediately, her previously blonde hair had drained entirely of color, leaving only a mixture of grays and whites. Both eyes shot open with a beaming purple light shining from the iris, while the eyeballs themselves remained mostly white, but with tendrils of red from bursting blood vessels. A splintering crack started to crawl across her face, like a porcelain doll smashed into concrete. The marks themselves contained no depth, but were black as abyssal night. The already slender child's skin became tight to the bone, stretching the limbs in painful ways. Skeletal, eyes sunken in, and teeth flaring out of the bleeding gums, she rolled on the ground, crashing her fists into the rock with demonic roars. 10 whole minutes of continuous agony, and the transformation seemed to have ended, but the expression of rage still consumed her. She rose from the ground with a hunch and dangling arms, panting erratically. Her head then cocked in his direction, aware of his exact position. She then rushed for the door. Her head crashed into the heavy barrier, making him stutter backwards a step and glare at the opening. Her head rose up to the slit, tilted with the terrifying glow of her hollow eyes cutting straight through him. Her ghostly gray skin and tightly bound flesh resembled a statue in matte texture. At a standstill, the two watched each other. Sin completely frozen, with a pleased look on his face, and Melody huffing away with a constant twitch in her bones and razor-sharp teeth ready to bite. He stepped towards the door and met this new creature face to face, searching for any piece of that innocence to remain. Her soul was there, though a sliver had been shaved away. That insignificant piece floated freely in the room, invisible to all except for beings such as himself. Inspiration then struck, and he lifted his palm up, drawing the whitish-blue sliver into his grasp. The vigorous, warm splinter rested in his palm, and by its touch, he was infected with her voice. A miserable incantation, crying, screaming to be released. A woeful cacophony drowning in the darkest of nights, forever tainted by a world she never understood. It then dissipated, wasted. Another task then added to his growing list of researches, but for now, he returned his eyes to the girl. First and foremost, he had to observe her behaviors and ensure she would not die. She appeared calm, patient, and brooding. The frantic breathing and twitching she displayed had become mute, but her keen eyes still focused with desire. He leaned in closer and met her gaze with a perceptive connection of his own. Feeling a sentiment similarly to Christine, he reached his hand up to the slider and touched the side of her face. The chill of her smooth flesh ran a motivational wave up his arm, a new form of life created by his hand. It hadn't really dawned on him till this very moment. One of a kind, and the first step to a new branch of evolution. Relieved to find success, he smiled and muttered the first name that came to mind.
What am I?
Eclipse. Her voice was high,
At the declaration
peeling back
of her
layers of
name,
air with a static
demons
filter that
spoke.
jittered from her throat, still dripping with blood.
You are the devil, a catalyst which will restore balance to that which I have damned.
Holding her face, he could sense the stone behind her eyes still fractured. Something to monitor.
The voices I hear. A petite girl. She cries.
She is you. She is frightened. Do not belittle her pain.
Silent stares bled into the air. The heat between them dripped down his face. With permission, the door was opened, and Sin examined her slender body. Muscle responsiveness, reception to pain, and many other little details. Evaluating her soul, he found that the frequency between the two matched near perfectly, harmonizing with every beat of her heart. Though something else became clear the longer he stood with this child, when the demon started to cry.
Where?
She groaned, torso crunching inward. She took a few steps back, retreating into the blackest corner.
Where's my mommy?
Melody's voice overpowered the malevolent filter. Rapid confusion took place, and the struggle reignited. The static returned.
Whore. Scum of peevish filth.
It snarled, speaking inward. Then her childish voice broke out again.
Please, what's happening?
she sobbed. "I will shred your soul in pieces, cur." Then, for a brief second, her eyes flickered back to the innocent blue, and again back to purple. It was only now that Sin realized exactly what he had accomplished. The personality in this form was not that of Melody. The souls used to create that stone culminated into a consciousness all their own, and now they were fighting for control. The demon's glare shifted to Sin, and anger rose up again. But before she could exercise that aggression, her body crashed to the floor. Laying on her back, pinned down by some invisible force, both of their voices exploded from her lungs at the same time. They shrieked. Behind their voice followed a fountain of blood shooting up and splashing on their own body. Sin watched in awe as the thrashing began once again, both voices simultaneously begging for help. Make the pain stop. Amidst the terror, Sin caught a ping from the other cell. Christine, too, was resonating with this monster and reacted similarly. Sin retreated to the other side of the door, closing it tight and monitoring from a distance. Extending his hand, he analyzed the stone inside. He could see it beside her soul, shaking at incredible speeds in such limited space, until finally, the splinter that formed soon after its extraction expanded, and the gem exploded, leaking all of its contained power into her body. This corruption spread through her instantly, giving neither of them any time to do anything about it. A wet tearing of flesh and the abrupt snapping of brittle bones filled his small dimension as her arms and legs extended like crooked tree branches. Flipping onto her stomach, her back then arched up and the muscles started to swell like pus sacs. All the blood in her body pooled to the surface of her skin, breaking through and spilling to the floor from many scattered lesions, while the remaining skin dried out and shriveled. Sections of her flesh from the arms, chest, and face started to melt off the bone, sloshing to the floor in a grotesque display. She screamed as her jaw snapped to a lower position, dislodging teeth and cranking it to the side like a decomposing corpse. But Sin continued to watch, taking notes of how her soul and the stone were reacting from this mutation while the prepared spells fueled her survival in this room. Panting with a low, bovine grunt, the girl propped herself on all fours, now 3 times the height as before. This thing whined in a low cry, hidden in the shadow but clear to Sin, who glowered at it, inspired. Its body hunched forward, lanky legs off-center and fingertips scraping the ground. It raised its head, one eye completely missing, with the other sunken into the skull over an inch. Her nose had dissolved, and her mouth dripped blood and saliva. With a hefty breath, it screeched for its mother. The cry sent a rippling shockwave through his dimension, scattering papers and miscellaneous items onto the floor and against the walls. The monster quickly proved itself to be agile and strong. Using its long arm, it struck the door and broke the hinges, blasting it wide open and forcing Sin back. The beast swung its arms incredibly fast into his side, the fractured bone sharp and splintered and inflicting a devastating blow. Caught off guard, he hit the floor and remained there, watching his creation take hold of the doorframe with both hands as it ducked under to exit. It raised its head up, towering above him and snarling fiercely. A deep gash bled from Sin's left side, but only enough to saturate the inner layer of fabric. Understanding the potential disaster, he raised a hand up to cast a spell, but the monster opened its wide jaw and bit halfway up his arm. His hand touching the back of its throat, the razor teeth shredded the arm of his suit and ripped into the flesh, while it twisted its neck from side to side. Sin grunted, now being lifted up by the strength in its neck. Then, a yellow glow seeped through the gaps in its teeth, and a concussive shockwave was blasted from his hand, freeing him from its bite and throwing the monster to the floor, unconscious. Huffing, Sin's arm began to reform the skin just the same as his side. Pain. This is the first time he's felt true pain in as long as he could remember. His mind spun with things to notate, primarily The secondary mutation had almost entirely snuffed her soul. It would seem a fair amount still remained, nestled at the center of the vile essence. From what he could sense, the darkness inside was coddling her spirit, almost protecting it from further harm. Nurturing. The sweat dripped down his forehead while his injuries finished healing. Now, he was left with a dying girl blessed with his own power and a mutated experiment far beyond his expertise. Melody was a failure. He couldn't deny that. Yet this endeavor solidified many inconsistencies and concerns he had had with the initial project. Having learned much, Sin exhaustedly tore open a dimensional rift to a place he kept close in his thoughts. A special place he had visited before the fall. This shaving of a drafted world, thriving with nature and a serene atmosphere. No doubt an experiment from a different maker that infinitely looped after a short distance. Melody was deposited here, for the time being. She was too powerful to keep close, far too dangerous. This special place would become her incubator and his observation room. Standing at the precipice of the saturated tropical world, he glowered at the withered beast as she lay in a bed of flowers. Much to his surprise, after a few hours of silently watching, her mutated form subsided. Clothes shredded, the child lay on the mossy ground, returning slowly to consciousness. The invasive cracks stretched across her skin all over her body. She wasn't completely normal, to say the least. Her hair was much longer and solid white. Her right eye was glowing purple with black cracks running along the face and down her chest. Her left eye was a dull human blue. The present heterochromia was a definitive indication of the coagulated souls conflicting with her own. He could sense the confusion, the overlapping thoughts of two very different beings. Ultimately, one quality stood above the discourse. With confidence, the word stable was inked onto paper. This audiobook is sponsored by Anchor, the best way for anyone to create audio content and make a little cash on the side. Worried your podcast isn't getting enough traffic to justify signing up? Well, don't, because Anchor is completely free, has creator tools for you to get started, and doesn't require a minimum listenership to start earning. Anchor distributes to Spotify, iTunes, Google, Overcast, Breaker, and many, many more podcasting sites, not to mention a custom RSS feed so you can share your show wherever you'd like. What are you waiting for? Sign up with Anchor today at anchor.fm. After the failure that was Melody, Sin underwent a severe lapse in confidence. Desperate to find a solution, Christine's fading life almost taunted him in idle moments of contemplation. He had to try again, now armed with new experience and praying he might find success. Knowing well that he had exhausted Charon's goodwill, he considered begrudging regret. He had no choice but to return once again and request another batch of souls. Swiftly, he returned to that all-too-familiar bazaar. However, he did not seek out Charon's domain immediately. Sullen and distracted by the many conflicting ideas that plagued him, he inserted himself into the bustling markets to seek something new. Though his stature among the sweltering crowd waned, every concession he eyed and each demon with a deal was repetitious and ceaselessly disappointing. For hours he wandered, collecting a handful of random scrolls and stone tablets that had hints of something related to one of many formulas he sought to brew. A new spell. That was his plan. Some way to extract souls and perhaps leave the human catatonic but alive. He hadn't a clue how stealing a soul from the living would render them. Time. Such a fickle currency so easily depleted by worrisome wandering. He soon found himself at the cusp of dusk, and the fleeting market began to sleep. Weary and numbed, Sin contemplated his recently established position with his old friend Charon. That part of him that dictated their relationship as nil, a sentiment he stood by, alongside ravaging despondency. Perhaps he could mend the kindred spirit. Perhaps through the promise of a better mingle, he could acquire what he needed, one last batch before it was too late. Desperate and ready to plea, he returned to the door hidden by rumor, his aloof key-bearer nowhere to be found. Odd, his clammy fingers caressed the items under his arm and shuffled towards the door, finding it uncharacteristically ajar. In the keyhole was the bloody and removed stump of Mupas, flesh peeled and bone inserted as every time before, though distinctly lacking that delicate consent. Armed with a stoic bolster, Sin entered the secret domain. A swell of darkness and eerie silence rang in his hollow mind, beckoning him forth to the coagulated pond. His footsteps echoed, tickling the fickle isolation with his overbearing presence. As he feared, face down in the crag with half his body sunken into the depths, was Charon the ferryman. His blood tainting the already decrepit pit, Sin glowered at the corpse, the scent of raw flesh still potent in his nostrils. Suddenly, a strange aura presented itself. Without turning to face this accosting figure, Sin conveyed a verbal warning not to get too close, if they desired another day of life. Relaxed and curious, Sin rose his chin and expanded his sensing energies. The return signal crooked his expression and wiped away that lackadaisical posture. Even more surprising, this entity giggled at his threat, then retreated a step. The hostility diminished, leaving an apathetic taste to linger. He turned now, clutching his small haul of parchment and stone with a look of weary banality. Before him was a human, or so it seemed on the outside. They wore a silk-hooded robe, the slack pinned to their shoulder by a large silver medallion displaying a symbol he had not seen before. A circle of hazy white quartz, jaggedly cut with care. At the center of the stone was a shaven point of black kyanite. Smiling wide, unblinking and radiating contaminated power, red veiny cracks climbed their neck and over their face, like fragmented bolts of lightning tattooed and embedded deep enough to trough the skin. Sin had a sinking feeling, one that was reinforced by two pairing factors. His pressuring signal returning a language of divinity in their peculiar eyes. Solid blue, glowing fiercely as all full-powered acolytes do, perfectly harmonizing with a blessing spell all receive when chosen by the council. Suspiciously, even that detail had something foreign about it. Each eye had a horizontal black cut in the center where the iris would be, revealing a layer of vermilion red beneath the sclera. His nostrils flared, then he stepped to the side, gesturing with a cynical tone at the body. The obvious question of her role in his death, but this person did not track him right away. Staring at his empty space, the ear-to-ear grin drooped to a pensive scowl through squinted eyes, their head tilted.
My name is Ave, and we have been watching you, Akram.
His eyes slowly widened as their feminine voice reverberated off the stone walls. Yes, then, he sniffled, grinning behind the casted shadow over his face. One illuminated torch kept them both warmed and distinguished. You said we? The girl giggled, though her face showed no amusement. Not anymore.
The Umbra clan. Surely you aren't blind to my true nature.
Acolyte. Of course, I sensed it right away. Though you are much more than that now. Pray tell, what is that debauched stench on your soul?
Lishmasters took us in a long time ago, under order from those filthy lords of court. The council never even noticed.
He nodded, asserting his posture and keenly listening. That would explain how you know me, child. You lot were an experiment then. A ruinous fate, no doubt. Her expression twitched, and the smile returned.
You could not imagine the horror, the evil it takes to convert a being of divinity.
I might, he sneered. No, the power emitting from this girl was sickly, fiercely supernatural and beyond either demon or acolyte. The smell of old rusted blood beneath her elongated fingernails and fresh crimson still clinging to her dead, ashy brown hair spoke true to her vile intent in life. Her expression reset.
I promise in exchange a favor for me, and something in return for you.
She spoke with haste. And what would you have to offer? He took a step forward.
Your mission for souls, halted by an unfortunate loss of the ferryman.
She tried to hold back the laughter, but miserably failed at concealing her ironic statement.
Perhaps fated to find you, with the collection we have, fated to assist?
Sin's fist clenched softly, then opened at his side. A determined examination scanned her bottom to top, searching for any additional data and mentally noting everything in this counter to log away later. I need to collect souls from the living. Whole, he said skeptically.
Not from the living. Only dead can release a soul.
Then I need something to catch the soul as it is torn from the host, he spouted angrily. Her head abruptly lowered, the hood concealing her face entirely. Then she took hold of her left sleeve and pulled the loose fabric up to the elbow. He glared at the skin, revealed by the flickering torch to be something beyond strange. Skeletal and frail-looking, the skin from elbow to fingertip was decorated in overlapping sigils, dead lettering, and ancient runes, all stitched and burned together to form one mass of stolen skin. Different tones of human, charcoal black as Faustus, red like Pharaoh's, and gray as any demon or lichmaster he has ever seen. A quilt of death and curses. Some of the lettering and sigils began to glow faintly as the veins beneath the surface began writhing. She grunted, then raised her head. The blue sclera peeled back now to reveal solid vermilion looking directly into his dull yellow eyes. In multiple, overlapping voices, she spoke.
The Umbra possess what you seek. A brand, a curse.
The layered filter was snipped, and the sleeve released. With a mighty intake of air, Ave raised her head again to look at Sin. The red in her eyes sectioned to thin slots once again. A pleasurable sigh and her tongue fell from her lips.
Kill the lords, and the brand is yours.
His brows angled, teeth sore from grit and patience whittling. A seize of power. Unsurprising.
Call it what you like. We prefer vengeance.
His lips pinched tight, the morbid worry of his identity to be used against him and the weighty implications of what murdering the lords could bring to Underworld. It was a heavy burden. In the end, there was no time to concern himself with consequences. The deal had to be made.
You have 10 hours. I will find you here.
Ave tilted her head back, the frayed strands of hair shifting like dry hay in the wind. She clenched her quilted wrist and gave it a squeeze, igniting one specific rune on her middle knuckle and disappearing without a trace. Sin wasted no time and exited the chamber, closing the door behind him and removing Mupas's severed limb without mourn. He set the items aside and hurriedly considered his options, knowing full well he could not kill the lords by his own hand. The seal placed on the Nexus gate would be broken should he take any life. The girl, Christine, was his first consideration, undoubtedly powerful and barbaric enough to take them on should he weaken them first. However, in a short read of her life force, he deemed her unfit to fight, leaving him one solitary option. He had to act fast. Bypassing the bazaar, he found himself skeptical of every glance that held on him for a second too long. How many eyes did Umbra have in this city? What exactly were they planning? Questions set aside for now as the market grew more distant behind him. Trudging across smoldering fields of wandering fiends and magma-ingesting beasts, a pinch in the back of his neck set him on edge. Doubt, worry, things he hadn't fully experienced in all his time, not quite so personal. In time, he arrived on foot to the great city of Underworld, a land for the profiteers of blood and slavery. Miles upon miles of stone slab architecture, creating a palace with their motte at the center. At the time of his arrival, the city had gone dormant. As his shoes clacked across the vacant streets, an expanding tickle of sensory made him so very aware of the few residents, holed up in their private palaces and unaware of his presence and intent. As he went deeper towards the center, he at last came across a demon walking on the road. Keen to each other, the demons stopped with one arm slightly held up and out, gripping a rope that extended a short distance away. At the end of the rope, was a naked woman, her skin ash and peeling, lacerated by whippings and one hand lobbed off completely. She was on all fours, huffing and salivating. She lowered herself and the dribbling sound of urination reverberated off the stone. The demon looked to Sin, his elderly appearance encased by a large tweed overcoat and dirty trousers. The demon nodded with the word,
Evening.
Sin, unbothered by the slave and her master, replied with a low grunt and a nod back. The pet human and demon carried on past him without another word. Sin raised his head and slowed himself, examining his surroundings closely. Such horrid evil resided deep below humanity. The predators from an ancient time grown into an economy of torment, and still there is discrepancy. Umbra, were they hoping to change this, or dig even deeper? Haste set in again, and he stomped towards the core of it all, the epicenter of hired chaos and taxed blood. At his feet was the first of 1,000 ascending steps, taunting him to turn back. It was time to put an end to his squirming, revitalize the child, and discover his new purpose. A way to fix this, a way to retrieve his power. For the first time since his fall, Sin nervously attempted to unleash his wings. Unsure of what might happen, the damage to his body, spirit, and its various abilities was truthfully unknown. He struggled, and the sting of emergence sent thunderous ripples throughout his spiritual core. Shivering, tense, he pushed harder until the bones shot from his shoulder blades, ripping through the coat and spraying blood a few feet outward. Panting, a bead of sweat slid down the bridge of his nose and dripped from the tip. The wings curled over his head, and it was there that he saw the condition of his greatest feature. Frayed feathers in a scorched, dusty texture, his wings were broken and caustic. A deep shame sunk down his throat as a mournful sentiment pumped behind each tired breath. The wings beat once, casting more flaking blood to the stone below and lifting him off the ground. Ascending the steps by flight, Sin experienced the drowning weight of wrongness, unforgivable treachery in his very bones, guilt. The faces of his abandoned family invaded his stringent mind, dipping his movements and scraping his toes against the 600th step. A grunt of fury bolstered his rise and careened him to the top. With a mighty thud, he set foot high above the city of the damned and retracted his wings, vicious tearing and cracking to finalize his blasphemy. He turned to face the overlook, and it was there that he got a true sense of Underworld's scale. The red sky still hundreds of miles above, crackling with thunder and black smog. A fiery, sourceless glow permeated across the land, stretching on and on without an end in sight. Infinite. A moment of true reflection once again invaded him. Before it could take hold, he whipped himself around and drew in a long breath. A door stood before him, a full story tall with rivets and steel densifying its structure. The breath was released, and his hand rose. A raw blast shot from his hand and knocked the door open, breaking it free from the frame and skidding the knotted wood and metal across the floor. Stepping inside, the clamor still echoing, he took solace in the wide-open hall he found himself in, lowering his hand with an oppressive emptiness inviting him deeper. The great hall beckoned. Empty, save for stained-glass windows depicting deific figures, gods and beings of darkness across time. Hundreds of feet back against the wall was a massive throne. A gnarled steel frame wrapped in the bones and flesh of perpetually rotting corpses, some still moaning and curling as their life refused to snuff. The mound of death that shaped his seat was the size of an oak tree. Side by side were the two expected figures. The ringing silence danced around them as Sin began his determined march across the tiled floor, amping his power to display his intentions. As he passed the colorful stained glass, they exploded inward, thick shards magnetizing and spiraling around his body, an antagonistic strut that provoked the lords to rise without a word. They each stood over 15 feet tall, their shapes exactly as described in the legends. Humanoid behemoths with bones protruding from various points in their bodies, their forms splintered like peeling bark with heads like deer skulls, eye sockets wide and dim, solid white. Sin cared little for their appearance or stature, haunting as they may be. He outstretched one hand, flattening his fingers and spawning a floating sigil in his palm. With the other, he gestured towards them and sent a hailstorm of dagger shards in their direction. In the smokescreen of his opening attack, Sin crushed the sigil and his hand blew the dust forward. The luminescent glow of the pieces reflecting in his eyes as they swirled into the shape of a door. The lords dismissed the glass with ease. Then, the brother on the left tightened to himself, invoking powerful magic to restructure his body into a claymore for the other to wield. The monster's heavy footsteps shook the room as he ran towards his opponent without a word. By the time he closed half the distance, the door had opened. A cold rolling fog spilled onto the floor, and the bright artificial light of a foreign dimension stunned the lord. From the portal exited Sin's own weapon, the disfigured abomination, Minerva. The door to De Vertu eerily creaked open. Hollow ringing pierced his ears as the silhouetted shape of Sin stepped inside. It had been 7 hours since his departure to fulfill her request, and by this point, the blood of battle had soaked into his overcoat and dried. Nose flaring with heavy breaths, the old man wobbled towards the center of the room, wary of his supposed isolation and drastic weakness. But of course, he wasn't alone. Ave revealed herself from the shadows, taking the spot where Charon's body had been left to rest, now gone. He blankly stared at the space between her feet, sighing for the loss of his acquaintance, merely a tickle of regret and fondness now entirely snuffed. Ave crossed her arms and leaned heavily against the nearby wall, a childish temperament inquiring on his success. Patient, Sin raised his hand up and snapped his fingers. A blip of white light before him spat out 2 decapitated deer skulls to the floor. The lords were slain as promised. Barely containing her jovial bounce, the excited girl hopped over the heads like she was skipping daisies and grabbed Sin by the wrist. He jerked back with a snarl, but relaxed when he saw her peel back the horrid sleeve, revealing the mess of discolored stolen skin. The air briefly swarmed with layered whispering, ancient chanting he recognized but could not assign an origin. She asked acutely, "Where do you want it?" A little too excited. He looked her in the eye, dissecting the red and blue palette with moderate suspicion. The arm she held tensed with invisible power as the bloodlust from this previous battle continued to flow through him. Watching Minerva slaughter the lords aroused a primal desire within, something he was finding difficult to control. Shifting his focus, he tugged on his collar and revealed a small area of cold skin on his left pectoral. She reached out and pinched a hanging piece of black skin on her arm and began to peel it away. The wet tear of the few binding stitches snapped and sliced free, shooting thick strands of blood all over his sleeve and coating the front of her gleaming face. Sin scowled at her twisted pleasure in this grotesque act, though oddly found himself drawn to the gore and twitching pain in her muscle. Before he could ready himself further, Abe fully removed the patch of skin and pressed it to his chest. A scorching burn like red-hot steel erupted in his torso as the flayed chunk melded with his own flesh. Ripping his arm free of her grasp, Sin lurched back in agony, body surging with foreign pain he had no concept of. Instinctively, he threw one hand out and grabbed Ave by the throat, arm pulsating with yellow-white energy beneath the skin and lifting her to his eye level. Her wide-toothed smile expanded and saliva dripped down her chin as both sets of fingers curled around his forearm for stability. A restricted cackle escaped her grit teeth, and Sin glared murderously into her misshapen eyes. The headache gripped him, weakening his hold, but he kept her there, furiously teetering on the edge of murder should this spell affect him any further. Ave continued to giggle evilly, but Sin kept his mouth shut. The gifted patch copied his natural tone, leaving only a single brand on the surface. Ink black, and what appeared to be a spiraling vortex contained within a barbed box. He only got a glimpse of it before it faded into his body, and the pain started to lessen. Her feet touched the ground, and Sin released her, averting his eyes and feeling the weight on his being. She leaned in close to his ear while he fought for a steady breath and instructed him with glee to take a few souls from the pond before he goes, as this room will never open again once they leave. She vanished, fading into the dark as nothing more than a blur of translucence. Utter silence befell this chamber, leaving Sin, one of the most powerful entities in existence, dumbfounded and perplexed. As instructed, he shuffled towards the pond and extended his arm, intuitively prying the lingering souls free and directing them into the mark itself. These souls were stagnant, unscreaming and penitent, a condition he scarcely concerned himself with, but took careful note of. The mark revealed itself as a bright, muddy gray light while it absorbed and stored the decayed essences. As Sin withdrew the souls and returned home, Ave reappeared miles away from the chamber, peeling her body from the murky black, beneath an oak tree that had grown through and around the skeleton of a behemoth creature. With a loud raspy exhale, she dropped from the rot and landed on the blood-stained soil by the roots. Immediately to her left and right were human slaves, naked, dirty, and scarred. They were scooping the bloody dirt in their bony hands and consuming it. Ave halted a moment, her poppy demeanor replaced entirely by ire and wrought disgust. Following the guiding chains that bound the humans to their master, she saw one demon holding the chains and 5 more behind him, lesser in form and on their knees in prayer before the tree. They noticed her appearance and immediately grew skeptical and defensive, especially when they saw what she was carrying. Ave raised from the ground with both massive skulls slung over her shoulder. Gripping their antlers like backpack straps, she smirked and gave the humans a final look before dragging her feet past them. Their eyes tracked the girl, growing wide as she approached her destination, the maze. At her front was a place with no name and no apparent origin, an impossible maze of stone varying in height from waist level to a skyscraper. Pillars and boulders tightly compacted in one place to form intricate hallways and tunnels 100 miles in diameter. In Underworld, this was the hell of loneliness, a punishment given to traitors sent to wander alone until they die. Once you enter, ancient magic soaked into the stone masks your existence, making you imperceivable to all others who wander alongside you. Every step is forgotten the moment the next is taken, leading to endless circles until death. The demon slave traders were left in her wake and she entered the maze. Like every time before, the magic attempted to grip her mind, but failed. Trudging forward, turning mesmerized corners and dipping under key archways, every means to confuse wanderers went unnoticed. The little tickles of an air current that didn't exist, a whisper to guide, even the illusion of another wanderer by your side, all provided to confuse. But this magic didn't work against Umbra. That is the reason why they took up residence. Aware of her location down to the exact coordinate, she stopped on a specific stone and whistled once. The gray slab wall before her began to rumble. Years of scratch marks and tallies separated as the stone pillars drifted apart, displaying an entrance. Her jovial pluckiness returned and she skipped inside the cave. Suffocated by the empty darkness, she twisted her left wrist and ignited a rune on her hand. That rune mirrored a duplicate on the wall nearby and set off a chain reaction. In seconds, the walls ignited with a dull blue string of lights and revealed the inner abode. She began humming a random tune and made her way deeper inside. When she reached the main quarters, she dropped the skulls to the floor and gained the attention of the others. 3 shapes peeled themselves from the walls, almost incubated in the stone. Loud popping and groaning of mobilized flesh coated her skin in familiar goosebumps as her siblings gather in a circle around the blood-stained remains. 4 figures, the Umbra, Ave, Maya, Sato, and Giorna, all harboring red within their blue eyes, all stemming from acolyte lineage and corrupted to this new form. As planned, the mark to allow Sin to gather souls and redirect them as desired was installed without suspicion or issue, and the second curse lies in wait. A curse that was derived from Acolyte's collective knowledge of the Council's contingency plan. A binding spell. Phase 2 had begun. Sin arrived at his residence between dimensions soon after receiving the mysterious mark. Greeted by thin silence and the vertigo of his home, his eyes caught the flicker of many candlelights painting the walls in a dancing orange. The journey of his fall to now bled colorless emotions he struggled to contain and understand. Conflicted, unsure of his goals, he removed his coat and sauntered towards the desk and sat, resting. An endless circle of doubt ran wild in his head. He couldn't shake this disturbing aura surrounding this mark, something incredibly specific to his power. He organized his thoughts for an hour, feeling the pull of his mission tempt his feet to move. Trust for that girl was not something he had, and it was clear that he must be cautious. Whatever it is she and Umbra are planning, it would surely interfere, and at some point they must be dealt with. But for now, they are a necessary resource, and he had work to do. Collecting the ditch from the shelf, he set up the necessary spells and potions to create a new anima from the final souls he had collected. Extracting them from the mark was pure torment, but once they were free from his flesh, he quickly established a link between the mark and the ditch, ensuring that any soul he plucked would automatically flow through the mark and into a specific reservoir within the ditch. This anima's creation went a lot smoother than Minerva's. He hardly referred to his notes except for the newest data collected and modifications to be made. Structurally weak points addressed, energy cycling veins inside rewired, the overall size increased, and the frequency at which the souls resonated within was finely tuned. Before the night was over, Sin extracted a complete anima, dripping with power and squirming with life. Right away, as it rested in his palm, glowing fiercely purple and steadily beating like a heart, he knew it would work. The way it hummed and leaned towards his own power, soothing. Sin opened the door to her chamber with initiative. There she lay on a pile of rags, her own nightgown shredded, bloody, and burnt. Breathing steadily, subdued by a spell bound to this room, he approached her at a respectful pace. Lost for a moment, observing her wounds, he felt that blow of pity in his gut. Determination overpowered doubt, and he lifted the sleeping spell. As the magic faded, the docile music it played to occupy her mind entered his own ears, a sound he did not choose, but was subconsciously adopted by her own memories and desires. It was a solid pinging noise, occasional and reverberant. A wind chime. Removing the refined gemstone from the pool, he was surprised to see it did not crack like the other. It was whole, though fundamentally weaker than Melody's. Its purpose was unique, and thus the core strength was disregarded. By his presence, she weakly raised her head with that same cold-hearted face. Her brown human eye abruptly shined bright yellow, and the static in the room raised to a palpable level. Sin snapped his fingers, and an orb of warm blue light spawned above his head, casting a deep shadow in many directions. She shielded her eye from the illumination, and he stepped closer. Reaching out and taking her by the wrist to keep her steady, he jammed the stone against her forehead. That connection caused her right eye to open fully and soak in the blinding light. Face going limp, the stone sank into her skull and joined the residual energies in a harmonizing dance. He released her, and she fell to the side, catching herself but hardly able to support her own frail weight. A twitch followed by a hum in the air and a spark in her eye. Her escalated breathing settled to a raspy intake and release, controlled. She looked up to him, hostility reduced. Right away, the still scabbed flesh that coated her left side started to heal. A white steam sizzled from every inch of exposed flesh, scarring over completely. Amazed by this response, Sin moved in closer and knelt down before her, placing his finger under her chin and looking her in the eye. Inside, the three energies seemed calm, melodically pulsating in a controlled, consistent regularity. Using his free hand, he touched her left eyelid and pulled back the skin, revealing the damaged eyeball as black with the purple iris proudly emitting its potent light. "Magnificent," he whispered. Though silent, Christine seemed to react to his words. blinking once when he released her and stepped back again. Like a puppet, she climbed to her feet and waited in silence. A flat, uncaring face defined her, and the left eye closed again. This breakthrough in balance gave Sin the single most important idea he had ever had. As he'd hoped, this artificial soul had stabilized his own energy within her, and thus that exact concept could possibly be applied to the piece of him keeping that gate closed. If he could create artificial energy capable of mirroring the raw power of half of his energy, then maybe he could swap the two, bypassing the seal and recovering his forfeit power. Lost in this new plan, Sin's distracted mind released the bright orb that hovered, smothering the glow and introducing darkness again. With the absence of light, Christine's demeanor drastically altered in an instant. Hunched down and snarling like before, she caught him off guard. Attacking him with a never-before-seen power, she slashed her hand forward, creating a razor-sharp gust of wind that flew by his head, just barely missing but still slicing through the right side of his neck, spurting blood onto the wall for a second before the wound closed itself. Alarmed, he retaliated with a conjuration, summoning his personal cane from nothing which crashed into her ribs. This physical attack had little effort and gave her ample opportunity to continue the onslaught. Similarly flailing her arms, she spawned a gust of wind which propelled her forward, allowing her to bite down on the arm he raised to defend himself. The bite itself started to burn his skin as some toxic energy seeped into his arm. This infliction caused an unexpected chain reaction. Without his command, 4 black tendrils exploded from his back, breaking through the door frame behind him and lashing out uncontrollably. Sin took her by the neck and removed her from his arm, throwing her to the back wall where she hit but immediately rose to her feet. These unknown tendrils flailed around, then retracted back into his body with shocking force, leaving his muscles throbbing and a mass confusion to infiltrate his thoughts. She came for him again, rushing quickly in a direct path. Unsure of what to do, he summoned that light again with the intent of blinding her. She stopped in her tracks, mesmerized by the heavenly glow. All aggression was gone, and her face shrank down to that empty stare. Perplexed by her reaction, Sin reduced the light to an ember, then snuffed it. She immediately lost control and moved for him, but regained it when the light flared up again. The very darkness which had nurtured her had become a trigger of malice. In the light, she is able to set aside that aggression, though she had not returned to herself entirely. The girl was still gone, but the animal could be quelled. He spoke to her, reaching for answers about her confinement in the past few weeks, to which she had no response, just a hollow gaze. Interestingly enough, some notable changes had occurred in her physical appearance. The right eye remained open wide and humanly brown, the other sealed tight by the mangled flesh. Her hair, which had been half burnt off, changed to a light cyan tone with some lighter and darker saturations. Every inch of her skin had lost its color, turning to a chalky gray and darker discoloration on the burnt half. The empty buzzing around them perforated the static charge built by hostility. His own eyes glowing with intent, he placed a hand on her shoulder. She didn't flinch. Christine Matthews, I believe you deserve a new name. He paused. Her silent stare unsettled and inspired him. Chrism. A metal blinder was then strapped to her head to cast darkness over her vision, and reinforced chains bound her arms behind her back. Now he could parade her around as his personal attack dog. A cruel grin split across his face, fatigue ignored with the new drive hurtling his feet forward. Dragging the untamed monster at his side, he departed this realm and began a new hunt for souls. More anima, more experiments. The targets he chose were indiscriminate, only needing to meet one of 3 criteria: corrupt enough for deprivation, innocent to beget salvation, and those walking the tightrope of their own morality. Age, gender, race, None of these things held any influence on who he targeted, just the balance of who those people are. Women, elderly, children, and men, all subject to his wrath, his hunger. When the first fell at Chrism's hands, and their flesh consumed by her insatiable lust for blood, something clicked in his mind. The depths of what he desired grew alongside the same ancient influence that caused him to betray his family. That ancient influence was becoming that much more intelligible. A voice, dating back to a time they never lived but knew all too well, infected every core belief within. Now feeling more alive than ever, he cackled at the growing pile of bodies. Each one killed had their soul plucked from their bodies, stored and transferred by this mark. Settled now with nearly 20 souls, his inflection altered. The mannerisms he displayed became poised, calculative to the grade of condensation, deriving unruly enjoyment from those which suffered by his command. But frustration grew alongside that hope and pleasure. With every soul that was violently ripped free by her brute strength, a large degree of its entirety was lost. Only broken, tattered shavings were deposited into the ditch, while the rest entirely vanished. Wasted. A healthy balance of good and evil, no doubt, but the required amount of needed souls rose exponentially with the waste. The demonic girl grew tired, slowing down with every single kill. Though, it was apparent by the gleeful, heinous noises she made while gnawing on bones that she was enjoying this. Over the next couple years, Sin and Chrism worked in silence, gathering clean souls as well as those walking the fine line of evil. At first they moved rapidly, tearing 50 from their hosts with ease. Of course, the portions they received per kill varied drastically, either giving them a significant leap or severe disappointment. Morale was staggering downward with the fatigue plaguing Chrism as her animalistic side now had its limitations. The anima within acted as a siphon for her to draw from, giving her the power to move at high speeds, endure pain, and overall heighten her performance. Wild and obedient, yes, but vulnerable to exhaustion. In the time they had collected the necessary amount of souls to begin a new generation of anima, Sin had been waiting for her voice to return. He knew she was still in there, always fighting to break the surface of her consciousness. He could sense it, but she never showed. When the blinder was off, she was empty, just staring at the beacons of light, opening her eye as wide as she could to absorb it, fearing the blackness inside a blink. He spoke with her just as he always had done, sharing stories of his times away from home, bouncing formulaic ideas off of her and doing his research in plain view. No longer did she sleep in that forbidden box, but she was no less a slave. At the precipice of his journey, Sin prepared the next anima. However, this series of gems were entirely different than that which mutated Melody and cured Chrism. Melody's was the entire anima at full power ingested at once, causing the mutation and imbalance. Chrism's was merely contained energy, all the human consciousnesses discarded as best as he could so another being would not manifest. The anima now had layers with a particular goal set in place. He had gathered subjects for this final assessment. First to be claimed was a girl, as females had thus far proven to be consistent test subjects and aligned with previously recorded notes. Anna, an 18-year-old girl with a curious disposition for personal suffering, had accepted his invitation in the hopes of exercising that taboo fixation. She was brought into the ditch personally to accept the anima. Upon receiving the stone, she too underwent a transformation like Melody before. Her skin tightened, hair lengthened and turned black, skin fading to an ashy gray. Both eyes inhibited the black and purple he had come to expect, and the gaunt in her face was ghastly to witness. With Anna, a distinguishing feature perked from her skull, pointed ears extending an extra 2 inches tall. The form settled nicely into her flesh and bone, and Sin watched carefully while she acclimated. Reading her energy levels as well as the human soul within, he concluded that things appeared to be normal. The now intentional crack in the gemstone had remained. A method of increasing their power through absorption, something he still needed to assess. She was then moved into a holding cell, a cage molded after the previous ones, complete with a sigil which formed a barrier to contain. There he observed her, asked her questions, and noted her responses. As he expected, this form took on an entirely new personality, one with a potent lust to kill, but not quite so ravenous. This demon was intelligent, displaying basic skills, language, and competence derived from the souls that made her, exactly as he designed. This demon was given the name Infni. In a few hours, the form reverted back to Anna. When control was passed along, she returned exhausted, sweating, and in pain. He asked her many questions about the experience and how she was feeling. She seemed comfortable with the whole thing, though that is to be expected given the girl's heretical nature. Even still, the sensation he got from standing in her presence now, compared to before, was just different enough for him to see that her sanity had become that much more unhinged, making her susceptible to harsher conditions of what came next. After sleeping for a few hours, she awoke refreshed, and thus the first test was a resounding success. What followed was the true epitome of his struggles. He brought Anna back home and was told to declare one person she wanted to eradicate. With a demented sneer plastered across her face, she chose her ex-boyfriend. Accepting her drive, he allowed her to pursue him and followed in secrecy. That night, when the two met up in her own apartment, she started to fantasize about how she was there to kill him, overjoyed by the fabricated ecstasy of watching him suffer. The transformation was triggered. Right before his unassuming eyes, Infni sprouted from beneath the girl's pale skin and propelled herself with a banshee shriek. Unable to defend himself, he was murdered right there on the couch, his eyes gouged. As designed, his essence, the life force of the soul, but not the soul itself, was absorbed by the anima, seeping into the intentional crack and used to empower the demon. Equally, Anna's own soul broke apart from the murder of another human, slicing off pieces and relaying to a specified place in the ditch, where it would then wait for the rest to join before being recycled for future anima. After this, Infni was locked in her cage and awaited a future test, one that would not only strain her own abilities, but also run the true limitations of the anima as it was pitted against a sibling. 2 more humans were taken from their lives, offered a chance at redemption or a path of revenge. Each gifted 1 anima, each transformed without a problem, and each tested against a human they cared for. Just as Infni and Anna before, they had passed and were quickly stored in a personal cage away from their brothers and sisters, unaware that any other demons like themselves exist. This process took place over a few weeks, during which time Anna had been left alone in the cage. A daily meal had kept her alive, but the hunger of the demon within could not be satisfied by bread and water. Infni began mentally tormenting her host, constantly taunting and disallowing sleep. Stir-crazy and desperate to kill again, they were both being driven mad by each other, unaware of what Sin was planning. After months of construction and planning, Sin finally appeared before each of them and opened their individual cages, joining together for the first time on the other side of their chamber doors. This place was a world made of blinding white with razor sand as the floor and clouds at their feet. They stood equidistant in a triangle, taking turns staring each other down. Infni could immediately sense the presence of her own kind, stating that each one of them was host to an anima. 14-year-old Evan and his demon Keldon appeared confident, staring her down with hatred and a desire to prove himself. At the other corner of this ever-expanding world was another boy, Jack, aged 21, and his demon Jairus. 3 humans, each with their own personal devil, dropped into this verse with one clear intention: battle to the death. That notion was proven accurate as Sin spawned at the center of the group, facing each one and calling out their names. He explained that this was the reason they were birthed. This is the final test. A mass transformation was triggered as all 3 hosts exploded with power and the demons came forth. Sin separated and watched from above as they wasted no time in brutally attacking one another. Infinity was targeted first as she was sensed to be more powerful than the other 2 individually. The fight was heinous, each displaying ferocity and determination like nothing he had ever seen before, agile, adapting, and merciless. The white sand was quickly painted red. As the fight progressed, Infinity was overpowered, brutally slain by her brother Keldon in a way that even Sin flinched at. Her throat was torn out, the meat and blood used to blind Jarrus temporarily, while Keldon pounced on his sister and caved her face in with his fists. The infinite echo of her screams and his monstrous bellows sent shivers across his skin, and a demented sneer formed. Exactly what Sin had been hoping for had been achieved. Like the human's essence, her own demonic energy was absorbed entirely. Every ounce of its total power was stolen by him and used to fuel his own strength. The increase in his power was substantial, enough to clearly define a difference between the remaining 2, which made Jarrus create as much distance as he could. It was no use. Within 1 minute, Keldon murdered his brother and stole his power. Sin descended from above after the hour-long battle, Keldon bloody and injured but alive and prosperous. Reverting back to Evan, his demeanor immediately changed. The young boy had become sickly and pale, his own soul clearly sustaining damage as the anima fed. Still, the boy was proud of his accomplishment, begging for Sin's appraisal, which he gave. And with that, the demonic parasite he had created was given a name: Tuffle. The first battle was finished. Many notes were written down, and the ditch successfully brewed the transferred soul fragments. Sin was well on his way to creating a legion of parasitic demons that would learn and grow, so he could take the fully charged anima and free himself from this prison. In the passing chunk of time, Sin abused Chrism's animal side to harvest innumerable souls from all over the globe. Many different backgrounds, religious beliefs, and cadences all converging into a refined being designed purely to adapt and feed. Though he had kept Keldon locked away during this time, a bar to be met for the next generation. After some time, the living total of Tuffle reached 4. 2 boys, Keldon and Craw. 2 girls, Venultia and Nyx. The human host varied in age, but went no lower than 10, given his failure with Melody at age 8. Sin did not want to risk the mind and body of an underdeveloped child to be his downfall as it nearly was then. He brought them all together before a wide doorway, a portal leading to the human world. There he explained what they were and what their goals were to be. The 4 children were to be sent into the world with the intent of killing each other. But before that could happen, they must shed the human soul within completely to become whole. Only then will they gain access to the ability of rift travel, which would allow them to pursue their siblings over greater distances. As such, the only way to eliminate the human soul within while simultaneously growing stronger as a result is to hunt down and kill other humans. A task easy enough to understand, but difficult to execute, for the human host has a majority control of the body. Only with their emotions triggered in personalized ways would the Tuffle be allowed to take over. Even so, the Tuffle should avoid the masses and keep their presence anonymous. Attracting the attention of local authorities and perhaps even fiends still left over on Earth could get them killed fairly easily. After they grow strong enough to shed their human skin, their identity can no longer be concealed within the host. They will assume their unique form and must find alternative methods of hiding if needed. However, by this point, they will gain access to a rift, which, as stated before, gives them the ability to travel across the globe by stepping into a white door. The white door then leads to a connected plane designed by Sin, a contained crossroads filled with doors invisible to anyone inside except the one they will need. When they finally encounter their sibling, they are to fight to the death and steal the other's anima, therefore absorbing all of the accumulated power. The Tuffle complained about the overcomplicated nature of his plan, and he simply assuaged them by explaining it isn't about the killing or raw power, it's the experience, the adaptation, and the will to do whatever is necessary to survive. True strength. When they are determined to be strong enough, Chrism will find them and challenge them. If they succeed at defeating her, then and only then will Sin grant them a mysterious reward. An award unspecified, but fantasized as many things. The reward itself was a lie. It didn't exist. Their completed and powerful anima was to be examined and determined whether or not it's strong enough to replace his own energy, but in their eyes, the reward meant taking Chrism's place at his side. This bold lie was necessary to fuel their ambition. With the rules and basics explained, and systematically established through a psychic link between the siblings, he opened the door and deposited them into the world. They each appeared out of separate doorways across the globe, starting with nothing and in their base human forms. The hunt was on. Meanwhile, as they cut through innocent and sinful lives, Sin monitored the soul fragments being sent to the ditch from the hosts, stirring them alongside the unused spirits swimming in agony, living through their worst nightmares in order to dissolve their core structure. After many souls had passed through the mark, Sin finally noticed an irregularity. Minuscule, almost non-existent, but just real enough to be felt each time. A splinter of some power, a different shade of white. This speck was familiar to him, and so, in his spare time, Sin began poking and prodding at the mark, using all manner of revealing magic to discover any fallacy or grain of something more, but he never found it. This idea remained nothing more than an itch he occasionally returned to scratch, but his work kept him busy. Constant soul rerouting and experimentation, redesigning the anima and making small deals with new hosts. He also returned to modify the ditch and the way that it affected the human souls within. How it tortured them and how it broke them down and recycled their power. That, and he had kept a close eye on those already employed in the fight. As the battle raged on, more anima were created, and thus more deals would be made. These teens were granted power in a controlled environment, a toxic living that spawned copious amounts of anger and resentment in the young, making them easy to seduce and strike a deal. With every anima that was crafted, the design altered slightly, changing with the knowledge he collected by observing. After a year of bloodshed and secrecy, Sin would appear before veteran Tuffle with the final test. Chrism, unchanged and lacking her binder. The advantage her opponents had in intelligence and rationality was vastly outweighed by her overwhelming raw power. Some were brought forth to test themselves and died by Chrism's hand. Discouraging at first, but inspiring to know that they have such immense potential. Their battles were closely observed and continuously influenced the future anima formula. The only time Chrism's full power was unleashed was when she battled Venaltia, a female Tuffle who had disposed of her human host, Amanda. In her form, she had slain many of her siblings and experimented with her unnatural abilities to the point of creative attacks. Utilizing her raw energy as a weapon, she even developed a mutation in one arm where her forearm turned sharp and elongated, shooting out from her palm as a piercing weapon. Venaltia was surprisingly able to keep up with Chrism's immense speed, dodging her random and unorthodox attacks and even countering with a few blows of her own early on. Blood was quickly shed between the two, and it would seem Venaltia had the advantage, until she made one fatal mistake. The primary ability she used to easily eliminate humans was her unfortunate downfall. Venaltia relished in the opportunity to defeat the mighty Chrism, using her energy to cast an impenetrable blanket of shadow over her opponent. The darkness swelled and consumed her body, and with that darkness, Chrism relapsed. A visible aura of swirling mixed energy spilled from her pores and ignited woeful fear in Venaltia. In seconds, the Tuffle was overpowered by her hidden primal rage, bringing an abrupt end to a promising disciple. For every fully functioning set of Tuffle born, others suffered through much less fortunate circumstances. Defective, either the humans became so incoherent that the Tuffle was trapped inside, or some Tuffle would take control but display no urge to fight, or openly defied their own father. A random, uncontrollable inconsistency derived from the makeup of every recycled soul. These defects were terminated indiscriminately and returned to the ditch to be broken down again. Tuffle had indeed reached their current anima's limitation, a hard cap where if any more power was absorbed, the stone would shatter, unable to contain so much power at this current stage. This limitation ceiling grew higher with every anima spawned, making it significantly harder to reach. Still, only 2 Tuffle had ever managed to reach that threshold, and when they did, Sin compared their strength to what was needed, only to come up short. Very short. Growing more impatient, Sin collected 2 promising subjects and placed them in a realm with Chrism, a realm without a source of light and no way to escape. Keldon and Zaya were forced to work together to have a chance at survival, but in the end, they both fell to Chrism's immeasurable power. Unfortunately, their total power was lost in that realm and could not be absorbed by Chrism's own anima. Long into the lifespan of this generation, something unexpected happened. Thus far, every Tuffle had only been killed by another, Chrism or themselves. However, the Tuffle era met with a different fate. He was slain by a mere human with a gun. Curious to learn what happened, he bound and blinded Chrism, keeping her close as he traveled to Earth once again. The body was collected, but the animal was dead, allowing Chrism to gnaw on the corpse while he considered further action. Sin sensed the Tuffle residue close by. The ink stain their attacks left in the flesh of the wounded led him directly to the one responsible. In a short time, he arrived at the apartment building and cast him and Chrism in a veil of silence and invisibility. Alone in his home, the man struggled with a new reality he had stumbled upon. Sin watched briefly, finding the humans' confusion and suffering had filled the room like a visible static blur. The man took the phone from the wall just as Sin was preparing to reveal himself. A conversation took place, a cry for help and a reach for compassion. The emotional phone call ended with a fragile and skeptical agreement. The person on the other end of the line was coming to visit. Allowing himself to relax, Sin waited alongside this human while Chrism huffed impatiently. It didn't take long for them to arrive. 2 women. One approached the apartment door while the other waited out of sight down the hall. The man answered the door, and a painful conversation took place. This is where he learned the man's name was Alex, and the woman, Rachel. They talked, argued, and when the man became fearfully hostile, the other girl stepped forward and assisted Rachel away. The women fled, and this man was left pleading for her return, desperate and broken. All hope left his body, and the last string that held him together snapped. This man murdered Ira. However, Sin's motives regarding this had just shifted. Instead of confronting the man right away, he held back and watched, checking in on the lost soul over the next 2 months, studying his misery until he came to an apparent suicidal decision. Now it was time to act. With a plan set in place, he appeared to Alex, Chrism ravenous at his side. Sin offered this man a deal that would grant Alex the love of his life in exchange for a child to be born, a replacement for the child he had killed. The deal was swiftly made, but little did he know that Sin had just planted the seeds to his own destruction. At this point, it had been years since he saw Umbra or even returned to Underworld, and this mark continued to be a blessing and a mystery. Returning home after making this deal, Sin sat at his desk and rested his chin in his palm. Chrism crouched on the floor behind him, focused on a candle flame. At last, it struck him, a tiny thought which cascaded into a theory. Right away, Sin retrieved a relic from his shelf, a small dagger with runes carved into the blade. These runes ignited with an incantation, then he inserted the fragile tip 2 inches deep into his chest. The mark flared with the invasive energy, seizing his body in a violent tantrum. Chrism's eyes shifted to her master as he grunted and recoiled from the pain, but when he removed the knife, a small sliver of his own divine energy followed the blade. The very instant the string of yellowed white floated freely, Chrism leapt for it. He sensed her motion, and he threw his hand out, casting her away to the wall of clocks where she rolled to a stop on the floor. Quickly, Sin plucked his own life force from the air and fed it through the mark. Nothing more than a brief inside glimpse, but that was enough. As it slipped between the complex spellwork, he saw it. The binding spell. It was imperfect, a mimic of their contingency plan should a council member go rogue. The very spell he feared of activating should he take a life. That insignificant piece he cut out, then transferred to the ditch, and almost immediately seemed to dissolve. Peculiar, but at the moment unimportant. Chrism pulled herself on the floor in a daze, huffing and drooling flakes of blood and skin stuck in her teeth. He glared at her, the gears in his head turning. This mark could be removed, but should he wipe it clean, he would lose the invaluable ability to manipulate disconnected souls. The only way he could see that whatever plan they had would fail is if they were dead or simply unable to activate it. He contemplated his options and came to the conclusion that Underworld was no longer needed. With the Lords of Court dead, Umbra would have surely taken their place as rulers, or at the very least, dismantled the established hierarchy. He understood rather quickly that Umbra wanted him to recover his power. They are entirely aware of his betrayal and evolving nature. The mark was to ensure he met his goals and then snapped shut like a trap. Whatever their plan was to follow, he would not know. Sin had to make a sacrifice, a setback to guarantee Umbra would no longer be involved. He visited the current most powerful Tuffle, still somehow preserving their host despite their own strength. A boy named Ray Davidson and his Tuffle Jun. 19 years old and having murdered his entire bloodline. This boy was taken by Sin and brought to a cave at the cusp of Underworld, a massive gate of thorns bound by paper sigils and stained through in ever-damp blood. It opened inward to a wasteland of magma and trenches. The boy stood confused at the sight, blinded by smog and deafened by eternal screaming from the very ground. Sin raised his hand, and the gate scraped across the crag. For the first time in history, the gate to Underworld closed tight. Without a word, Sin took hold of the boy as he transformed into a Tuffle, sensing the danger. Before he could do anything to stop it, Sin spiritually ripped the anima from his skull. As it slipped from his skin without a drop of blood, Ray's own soul followed, magnetized to its partner. Twisting and attempting to break free from his binds, the anima stone shined fiercely as the limp body hit the ground. Both were very much alive, but their essence was converted into the very same magic he used to get here. a seal for the gate. With such a powerful Tuffle and human soul as the lock and key, Underworld was sealed, and now the Umbra had no way to activate their binding curse. Earth was entirely his. The macabre gate of a forbidden land rested before him, impassable and warbling with dense Tuffle radiation. The pressure of sustained unnatural life force burned his skin as it dribbled from the fibers of its own existence. A pit in his stomach caused a retreating step. The human boy's mangled expression flashed in his mind. What he felt wasn't regret, nor was it empathy. It was a feeling without a name, and encompassed so many varying degrees of humanity and superiority. The history of his long life and the burdens he carried, his own name, began to spiral, a name he hasn't been called in years. His hand rose before his face, and the fingers curled with a shake. Ave wandered into his thoughts, and he imagined her neck in his clutches. Her twisted grin and mysterious skin patches continued to arouse questions, not only about Umbra and their true intentions, but what sort of power such a creature has. An acolyte, corrupted. What could they possibly be capable of? A snarl, and his arm fell. He had to resign to the fact that now he may never know. The chaos in his mind was a silent hurricane of doubt. Mupas and Charon, perhaps they too were pawns, an intricate plan to manipulate him. He may never know for sure, and as of now, they no longer matter. Arguing the logic behind preceding events did him no good, not with so much else to be done. The anima was not perfected, and Chrism must still be nurtured. The hope of returning her mind was nothing more than an opaque blue lost somewhere in the whirlwind. His hands slipped into his pockets, and a heavy exhale followed. He offered a sentimental gaze through the rebar, admiring the fumes rising from the hellish marshland beyond this world. In a smooth motion, he turned back to depart. A few echoing steps through the cave of swirling brown and red hues, and Sin was absorbed by a blinding sunlight. A warmth of teeming life all around him assisted in resetting his composure. He raised a hand again to summon the portal, but stopped, delaying his travel home in favor of something new. With a twist of his wrist, he brought forth a door to an unknown destination, randomized without a preference. A large circle of clay bricks bore his sudden appearance, a location within this apparent small town that all foot traffic passed through. All around him were thin huts and shops, delicately placed and separated by thin roads between. There was no clamber of crowds, no cars or electronic signs. There were just people, riding bicycles and carrying baskets of laundry or food. A handful of smiling people sitting on the brick and strumming an instrument for all to appreciate, without cost or request. A community content in their humble village, carrying on with daily duties and minimal societal expectations, never wary of the hell that lurks or the cataclysmic power high above. They had their own view of religion and fate, what happens when they die, and all the history that came before. Their lives are such, a cycle on a timer with limited and endless possibilities. A gentle stride across the man-made road led his worries astray. Casual and immersed in the surrounding simplicity, no sense of danger or even concern for his surrogate daughter. The ache and strain that trudged him forward daily were thinly veiled and waning. For the moment, he was nobody. Envy, something he never considered until now. He could picture himself alongside them as nothing more than another human, another meaningless blip, destined for nothing and impacting nothing. And it was because he could envision this that his ideals were reinforced. Who he really is might be a daily struggle, but regardless of where he came from, he understood what truly had to be done. The past had proven that cataclysm is a natural result of life. Mundi Commandenti was the cleanser of all. It was born from imbalance to stabilize. Harmony cannot exist if intelligent life is allowed to wander. The palate must be cleansed, and now that the gates are sealed, the world can finally be saved. Time to this fallen god was not so linear, but it progressed alongside him regardless. Years had come and gone. Innumerable gallons of gore had been spilled, and countless souls repurposed. That day in the humble village, a distant memory. The death by Tuffle hands had yet to rival Chrism's own body count, and it still wasn't enough. The anima continued to be flawed and expectedly tweaked. The goal he felt so sure of was growing only millimeters closer. Still, he experimented. Both gates had remained closed all these years, and no word from those barricaded outside this world had slipped through. That long-past life is merely a blur to the decrepit moral shell, guided only by a wrathful desire for freedom. Whether it was Akram's or the shadow inside was indeterminable. In his spare time, he tempered Chrism's rage, but to limited results. He did, however, discover she had an aptitude for special abilities. When he used her as a test against one rising Tuffle, Aul, she displayed amateur attempts at psychokinesis and energy manifestation. Once the fight was done and she was victorious, Sin took her aside and trained her to better control these things. The search for a better way than anima continued. However, without access to Underworld, he had only his compiled research to exploit. While it was indeed a wealth of knowledge on nearly every subject, supernatural and otherwise, there wasn't any ground to break. Different spells were crafted and his own abilities had been extensively explored, but nothing directly towards his goal. Then, an old accord was suddenly in question. The simple human that had murdered his son Ira and struck a deal for love had just attempted to flee. Sin tracked the ditch link he had tied to the child and followed close behind. At first, it appeared to be just the new family moving, but once Sin got close and read the man Alex's emotions, he understood that this was him running from their deal. This ignorant human was woefully unaware of Sin's power and influence, believed to merely be a demon tied to one location, believing that he could simply drive 1,000 miles away and be free from the curse. Alex's egregious act of preservation angered the god, and still he held back. The family settled in a little home buried in the trees, unpacking their lives and debating the sacrifices they made to take a new step. The dynamic was intriguing, to say the least. The words she spoke and the emotions she presented were a projection. In reality, she was screaming. Cursed to love a man she once had grown fond of and dismissed. His overlooking of the twitches in her face and the rare moments where she would cry through a smile were hauntingly fascinating to witness. Sin kept a close eye on the budding family until the child he had claimed turned 8 years old. By this point, he had grown tired of Alex's happiness, growing ever infuriated by the audacious attempt to steal her love and hide the child. The anger Sin tempered had finally given way to action, and so he manipulated the man away from his home, bringing the wife for a drive in the dead of a winter's night. Once separated from their daughter, he allowed Chrism to practice her abilities, taking hold of the girl's heart with her magic and slowly crushing it. Sin released the grip on Alex's mind and the car skidded to a disoriented halt. Faced now with a disobedient human, a hateful argument took place. With Chrism using her energy to hold Rachel's heart hostage, Sin bathed in their anguish. Suddenly, he felt a disturbance, a mere shiver. Visibly concerned, Sin gave Chrism specific instructions to finish the girl as punishment, but leave Alex alive. While Chrism was still unhinged and monstrous when blinded, she was much more susceptible to his command. Sin fled the scene and swiftly returned to Alex's humble home. Masking himself in the cold darkness, he maneuvered through the walls until he entered the upstairs bedroom and discovered the young girl whose soul was traded. Kimberly Ann Avery. She was a fragile thing, innocently sleeping under the covers with only her brows and head poking out. He stood at the edge of the bed and expanded his senses. It was as he feared. The child was no longer claimed. The deal they had made, which bound her soul to the ditch, was broken, either by Alex's act of defiance or Sin's own murderous actions. Either way, the cosmic powers that he had been abusing for his own gain were severed. Even now, he could not simply reattach the tether. The girl adjusted herself in the bed, rolling onto her back and rubbing her left eye, asleep still. In the air, there was a microscopic static, an electric bubbling hardly sensed from within the girl. A nightmare. There was something odd about this little girl, something that remained and held his curiosity. A thought back to Melody made him reconsider his brief debate on waking the child and presenting a deal now. He would have to return, make a new deal to reclaim her soul when she's older. Until then, he would have to keep a close eye on this child. Feeling sentimental, he departed and returned to the car to collect Chrism. When he arrived, he immediately concealed himself in shadow when he discovered blinding lights all flashing erratically. Ambulances and police cars were all over the road, which told him right away that she had not killed Alex as requested. That said, Chrism herself was nowhere to be seen. Immediately, he closed his eyes and focused on sensing his own energy in the wind, but there was nothing. She was simply gone from this world without a trace. Worry overcame him and he hastily spawned a door behind a tree, hidden in the banished shadows from the perpetual flashing lights. Anxious fury carried his step forward until he exited the rift he had created. His shoes clattered on the stone floor with a light echo as the pressurized silence bore down on him. Home. The door vanished behind him the moment his eyes fell on her back, her shape silhouetted in front of a lit candle. Patiently watching, her hand rose from her side and hovered over the candle for a moment, before pinching the wick. Shadows densified around her, now only partially illuminated by the other distant candles. One by one, she slowly moved about the room, keeping her back to him and snuffing each candle individually. He could tell from the moment he saw her that she was different, even just by her posture. She stood upright, head straight and arms loose. Each step was considered and taken in stride, methodically and balanced. There was a sway to her movement, like the weight of her own body carried on past her motion. When all of the flames were out, she finally turned to face him. The blinder was gone. One eye opened wide, and she had a vacant expression. Even in the thick darkness, he could clearly see the human brown iris. Cautious, Sin spoke at her, expecting silence or snarls as a response like always. But she offered nothing, and the devoid stare left him feeling thin. The noise he sensed was hardly distinguishable, but it was there. Some little tune in the air, a chiming so distant and yet directly between his ears. He then asked her how she got here without him. She responded, against all expectations. The words, "I remembered where," were muttered in a low and toneless voice, expressionless and lacking urgency. Amazed by her words, Sin's brows raised and a big-toothed grin split across his face, and he asked what else she could recall. She took her time answering, holding her breath for a near minute before expositing a brief history of Sin and his journey, a story abbreviated from his many retellings over the years. Impressed and overjoyed by this, Sin could hardly contain himself with a sudden breakthrough. At last, her mental had returned. At last, she was what he had needed all along, though the mystery of exactly how she was freed from the monstrous personality was unanswered. Truthfully, he didn't care. The possibilities her evolution now presented were overwhelming. Trembling, he approached her and examined her flesh, the burns, and her eye. She stared lifelessly. When he finished processing, he presented her with one final question. Do you remember your name? The darkness that swelled around them almost seemed to distance itself from their joining at the center of the room. His bated breath slithered between his pursed lips as he glared into her open eye with sour anticipation. Her voice was airy, iris twitching between both of his. He repeated, "Do you remember your name?" And she responded, "Chrism." Elated by this, he did something neither of them expected. He pulled her in close for a hug. As much as he wanted to believe this hurdle had been conquered, the depths of what unraveled in her mind were nothing he could ever imagine. Her soul was reignited by the death of Rachel McGill. The proclaimed innocence and witnessing of her sins awoke something long buried. Her true name is there, safeguarded between the surface of her establishing facade. Everything she had done since the fall, all the lives she took and the flesh consumed, all of it was screaming inside of her, all the innocent souls casting blame, damning her to misery and hate, all because of him. Even now she cannot cleanse the anguish of all that she lost, because the memory of killing Kevin Ruxbury is already there. She had done it, but it wasn't even her. Everything was stolen from her, even revenge. He pulled himself back and longingly stared, unaware that she knew it all. A bizarre, heartfelt smile had little impact on her emotions. Now, with his ambitions so clear, Chrism had new work to do, keeping Sin from achieving his goals and ensuring that evil is never released on this world. Her goal was to destroy him.